This page is the cover of issue 11 of N64 Magazine from January 1998, a proper blast from the past. Right in your face is Link from Zelda, looking all heroic, taking up a good chunk of the cover. It's a Japan special issue, and they've played the games of 1998 bit presumptuous considering it's January 1998, but magazines always were, weren't they? They're teasing some of the big games we were all buzzing about back then. Zelda, naturally, probably Ocarina of Time, which was a massive deal, then Banjo-Kazooie, another one everyone was hyped for, proper colourful platforming, F-Zero X, for those of us who liked our racing fast and futuristic, and 1080 degrees snowboarding if you were after something a bit cooler, and Yoshi's Story, for something a bit more cutesy and platformy again, and NBA Basketball, which, well, basketball games were always there, and rounding it off is Pocket Monsters, which is obviously Pokemon, though we didn't really call it that much over here back then, did we? More Pokemon. They reckon they've played them all. Bit of a boast that. Down in the corner they've got little screenshots, San Francisco Rush, a proper arcade racer, and 64 Sumo, which, well, sumo wrestling on the N64, each to their own I suppose, and it's got a little globe chap waving a controller promising Japanese and US news and reviews. Typical magazine cover, trying to cram it all in, promising the earth. And it says, free! N64 companion book in the corner, bet that was a thin little booklet if we're honest. Still, good times. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 11, kicks off with a bit of an explanation of how they do things here at the magazine, under the title, How N64 Works. It's basically saying they take reviewing games seriously, and won't just hand out top scores willy-nilly. They're independent from Nintendo so they can be honest, which is always good to hear, isn't it? And they reckon they're on top of getting reviews out for games, as soon as they appear in Japan and America, so you know what's worth looking forward to, which back then was a big deal when import gaming was still quite niche. They also boast about having experienced Nintendo fans writing for them, trying to cram each page with useful info and advice. The bottom line is, don't be fooled by feeble imitations, which is a bit cheeky. Then on the right-hand side, it's the Welcome to N64 Magazine editorial, looks like written by Jonathan Davies, the editor. He starts off in a bit of a reflective mood about the end of the year. You know, Auld Lang Syne and all that. He mentions the N64 arriving in 1997, and bringing us classics like Super Mario 64, Mario Kart 64, and GoldenEye 007, those were the days, weren't they? He even mentions seeing stuff at the Nintendo Space World show in Tokyo, and reckons 1998 will be even better, which is a bold claim. He then mentions Yoshi's Story, saying not to underestimate it despite its kids' TV look, and reckons it's packed with weird characters and funny moments. Apparently someone called James hasn't laughed so much since. Well, never, unless you count his asthmatic wheeze, bit harsh on James there. They are waiting for the Japanese version so they can review it in the next issue, and then they mention the 64DD in a very vague way, just calling it interesting. Then he talks about Zelda being amazing, especially when you get to the big bosses from Space World, and reckons the graphics of Lyot Wars, which we now know as Star Fox 64, make other games look rubbish. He's properly hyped, saying it makes your tummies go tight and we lose our appetites. Bit much, mate, but we were all excited for Star Fox back then, can't deny it. Finally he ends on a slightly odd note about finding caterpillars in his kitchen, climbing on the cooker and trying to get in his Weetabix, and then just wishes everyone a happy new year. Bit of a strange way to end the editorial, but there you go, that's Jonathan Davies for you. This page is the contents page from N64 Magazine, issue 11, January 1998, so it's kicking off the year with a look at the games of 1998 fresh from Nintendo Space World. It's all about what's coming to the N64 later in the year. First up, there's the N64 Arena section. Reviewing games already out starts on page 32. Then San Francisco Rush gets a bit of a spotlight on page 34. Remember that one? Proper arcade racer that was. Midway serve up a new kind of racing game. And we like it a lot. Well, yeah, it was pretty decent, wasn't it, Tori? Import Arena, for the Japanese and American games, kicks off on page 40. There's Aero Fighters Assault vs Wild Choppers. Two new flying games, one American, one Japanese. Which turns and which burns? Bit of a vague write-up there, lads. 64Q Sumo gets a mention on page 46, described as fat, just a bit sweaty, and a big surprise. Sounds intriguing. Then there's Wheel of Fortune, page 47, the first N64 game with video clips in it. Blimey, groundbreaking stuff back then, eh? WCW vs NWO World Tour is on page 48. More sweaty men grapple with each other. Yes! Bit enthusiastic there, are we? Famista 64 is on page 50. Namco enter the N64 Arena. Strike! Etc. And finally for the import section, Mortal Kombat Mythologies, Sub-Zero, on page 51, with just one word, Urk. Not exactly selling it, are they? The games section on page 56 is, tons of carts to look out for next year. Some great, some just plain odd. Always the way, wasn't it? There's a section about the 64DD on page 66. The first N64 disk software has finally been revealed. And blimey. Crikey, sounds exciting. Page 70 is Miyamoto. N64 Magazine meets the man behind Mario and Nintendo's Big Cheese. Always good to hear from Shigeru. And rounding it off on page 74 is Diary. Your guide to how to make the most of a game show in Japan. Handy for anyone planning a trip to Tokyo, I suppose. There's also a big picture of Link, looking all moody, and some screenshots dotted around a racer, a couple of playing games, and a picture of the 64DD itself, that ill-fated disk drive thing. Yeah, typical contents page, laying out what's inside this issue, and teasing all the new games coming in 1998. Good times. This page is the contents page for N64 Magazine. Right at the top it's got Planet 64 Inches, which is their new section. Looks like it's got all the gossip from some big Nintendo show, probably Space World I reckon, talking about pocket camera photos, which were all the rage back then, weren't they? Then there's a coming soon section, again mentioning Space World and a bunch of future games, RPG news, something about Fusoya and Tokyo news from Max. Sounds like they're covering all bases. Moving down, there's the N64 How-To section, guides to ease you through life, it says. Bit dramatic. First up is Become a Diddy Kong Master, page 78. Diddy Kong Racing was pretty big at the time, Rare were on fire back then, everything they touched turned to gold, so a guide for that makes sense. Then there's Make Mischief Mischievously, in Mischief Makers, page 86. Mischief Makers, yeah, bit of a quirky one that, treasure game, proper mental, but good fun if you were into that sort of thing. Bet that guide was a bit bonkers too. And finally in that section, Beat Everyone at 2-player Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey. Gretzky's Hockey, yeah, everyone had a bash at that, proper button basher, that one. Then on the right, Future Look, big news on the big games, kicking off with Banjo-Kazooie on page 6. Banjo, that was the big one everyone was waiting for, wasn't it? Rare again, promising, amazing special effects, they usually delivered to be fair. Then Zelda, Ocarina of Time, the biggie, it says, page 10. No kidding, the biggie, everyone knew Zelda was going to be massive, and blimey, it was. Fantastic, blimey, yes, says the reviewer, ZY, or Zai I suppose. Underneath that, 1080-degree snowboarding, page 14. 1080, yeah, nice snowboarding game, a surprise announcement from Nintendo's Wave Race team, interesting connection there. And finally for the future stuff, F-Zero X, page 16. Makes Wipeout look like one of those wet wipe things, it says. Bit harsh on Wipeout, but F-Zero X was seriously fast. Like properly mental speed, made your eyes water. Down at the bottom are the regulars sections. Tips Extra, page 94. Granules of concentrated gameplaying knowledge. Sounds a bit wanky, but yeah, tips section. Club 64 Inches for letters and disturbing photocopies. What were people sending in? Subscriptions, back issues, directory, just the usual magazine bits and bobs really. Rounding it all off with N64 Magazine rolls onwards gathering snow and twigs. Snow and twigs. Typical magazine nonsense trying to sound profound. Anyway, that's the contents page. January 1998 takes you back, doesn't it? This page is all about Banjo-Kazooie. Looks like they were really pushing it at Space World, calling it the Space World star. Beaten only by some RPG. Cheeky. Apparently, they even had female demonstrators dressed up as Banjo characters. Blimey. There are a few screenshots. One showing some semi-transparent effect. The reviewer Zai seems a bit underwhelmed by it, calling the chap miserable. Then there's another one with a big blue bull, looking proper angry, and Banjo about to face it. They didn't even play that bit, but they reckon you'll need a cunning plan. Those horns do look a bit nasty, don't they? Warrington Knoll. It's a Rare and Nintendo game, naturally, and slated for release in April, both in Japan and the rest of the world, so not too long to wait then. Seems like they were quite impressed at Space World. All the Live from Space World 97 badges on the page. Well, it did look pretty good for the time, didn't it? This page from N64 Magazine, harking back to January 98 it seems, takes a look at Banjo-Kazooie, which was causing quite a stir at the time. It's got that big bold title, OIE Bird and Big Bear, so you can't miss it. There are a few screenshots showing off the game. One shows Banjo and Kazooie flying around. Apparently, Kazooie can carry Banjo for short hops as he's a heavy chap for a small bird, according to the caption. Another picture seems to be in a foresty area, maybe showing off some of the graphics and level design, which they say were done on Silicon Graphics workstations at Rare. hence the fancy visuals for the N64. The article itself, written by ZY, or Zai as we should apparently say, mentions Banjo-Kazooie was a highlight in Nintendo's Space World even if Zelda kinda stole the show. They were surprised by how much fun it was, even though some folks thought it looked like a kid's game. The reviewer reckons it'll appeal to all gamers, even the grumpy ones, which is a bold claim. They talk about the opening bit of the game, where you go to a central hall to pick your next adventure, comparing it to what Namco and Nintendo were doing, calling it a central hall vehicle. Bit of a dig at the originality there, but they then say it's better than just exiting to a select screen, so swings and roundabouts I suppose. They do make a point that in Banjo-Kazooie, the hall is a cave, because the main character is a bear, which is their way of saying stop complaining about it being derivative. The reviewer seems quite impressed with the atmosphere, saying it's immersive, even though you can't see miles into the distance, comparing it to driving in heavy fog. They also mention the graphics being opulent compared to Mario, and point out details like realistic water ripples and climbable trees. They saw sections with giant crabs and bug-eyed crocodiles, saying it's a realistic environment in a slightly sarcastic tone, given the giant crabs and crocodiles. They describe Banjo as a brown bear with a bird in his rucksack, and mention that the worlds don't look like they were dreamt up by a graphic designer who only likes tofu, which is a slightly odd but amusing comment. The article highlights the innovation of being able to switch between controlling Banjo and Kazooie, which they say is better than previous attempts at swapping systems, and it's not just a matter of personal preference, each character has different attributes. Finally, there's a little box at the bottom of one of the screenshots saying you need to collect 100 of these musical note things per level, which is a very Banjo-Kazooie thing to have to do. It mentions there will be swamps, deserts, seaside coves, mountains and caves, trying to give the impression of varied locations. This page is a look at Banjo-Kazooie, right in the future look section. They're banging on about how you can switch between Banjo and Kazooie to get around, like swimming with Banjo then swapping to Kazooie for climbing, which sounds a bit fiddly but they reckon it's brilliant once you get the hang of it. Apparently the enemies are supposed to be cute but still a threat, which is a bit of a weird combo, isn't it? They mention sharks and giant mechanical fish in the water, and some lizard things popping out of holes. The reviewer talks about different ways to deal with enemies, like rolling into them, or getting Kazooie to lift you up for a dive bomb, or even just pecking at them. Sounds like there's a fair bit to it. They mention the game is Rumble Pack compatible, but then admit they were so into the game they didn't even notice it, which is a bit of a backhanded compliment to the Rumble Pack I suppose. Then there's a bit about where you'll be going, listing these world names like Mambo's Mountain, Treasure Trove Cove, Clanker's Cavern, Bubblegloop Swamp, and Gobi's Valley. Typical Nintendo, bit daft aren't they with the names? Your job is to grab musical notes and puzzle bits, and they reckon there are stages numbered 7, 8 and 9, which is a bit cryptic. Energy is honey cells apparently, which they think is cute. Right. There's a little bit about the intro being Banjo playing guitar and Kazooie on trumpet. Yeah right, whatever you say. And right at the bottom there's a live from Space World bit saying the video from Space World had loads of Banjo-Kazooie footage and Nintendo are clearly expecting big things. Well, we'll see about that, won't we? This page from Planet 64, the Future Look section, is all about Banjo-Kazooie, which was a game we were all properly chuffed about back then. It's got a feature called Bag of Tricks going through some of the controls. Seems like they were having a bit of trouble getting their heads around them, which is fair enough. Rare games could be a bit complex, but in a good way mind you. They're talking about top C for first-person view, trigger to duck or slide, and trigger and top C together to use items. Standard stuff really for the time if you were used to Zelda or Mario 64. They mention the camera is automatic like in Zelda, but you can switch to first person with top C, good to know. The roll move is described as a softies move, bit cheeky, and they point out, Banjo looks like a gorilla when he does it, rather than a brown bear, haha. Always nitpicking, weren't they? Then there's a bit about Kazooie helping with swimming and getting Banjo on his back for faster movement on inclines and stuff. Pressing A instead of C for a flutter jump, that's a bit fiddly. The next section is called Giving Them the Bird, which is a bit of alright in it. It lists a bunch of attack moves, like jump plus trigger for a dive bomb, trigger plus B for a beak attack, and egg missiles with trigger plus right C and trigger plus left C. They reckon combining the Z button with others is hilarious and dangerous. Good stuff. Dive bomb is aerial, beak attack is stabbing, and egg missiles demolish things. Sounds like proper rare mayhem. There are a few screenshots dotted around. One shows Banjo and Kazooie with some crocodiles, looking a bit like a scene from a cartoon. Another one shows Kazooie carrying Banjo. They're surprised how strong her legs are, despite their, diameter. And there are some little screen grabs at the bottom showing some in-game action I presume. Looked good for the time, even if a bit blocky now. Right at the bottom it says to be continued, and, gah! It's still ages away, but we'll keep you up to date until then. Games always felt like ages away back then, especially the good ones. January 1998, yeah, we were all waiting for Banjo-Kazooie, weren't we? Seems like they were still figuring things out at this point, but already building the anticipation. Good times, good times. This page is a future look at Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time from issue 11 of N64 Magazine. It's a first impressions piece from Nintendo Space World 97, which really does take you back. Big Link face on the page, looking very serious, classic. The article talks about seeing Ocarina of Time for the first time at Space World, and they were clearly pretty impressed, saying it was amazing. They were transfixed apparently and thought it would change things forever. A bit much maybe, but hey, it's a magazine preview, gotta get the hype up. They mention interviewing Miyamoto too. Lucky devils. There are some screenshots showing the intro sequence with a horse and 2 riders, which we later find out are Link and Princess Zelda fleeing the castle. And then there's Ganondorf on his black horse, looking suitably evil, described as a younger incarnation of Ganon. Intriguing stuff at the time. The page also notes the Japanese release is set for April, but for us in the UK it's still TBA, so we were going to have to wait a bit longer as usual. Ah well, good things are worth waiting for, as they say. They certainly seem to think this was going to be a good thing, with all the go, go shouting. Enthusiastic bunch at N64 Mag. This page, from what looks like an old N64 Mag, is all about Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Right in the middle, there's a moody-looking screenshot of Link cautiously entering a new room, dagger drawn. They even have a little caption underneath saying it's best to be careful as you never know what might jump out. Classic Zelda tension, in it, won't it? Above that main pic there are a few smaller screenshots. One seems to be a top-down view, maybe using the R button as they mention in a little text box. Another shows the menu system, they call it a button menu, and it changes depending on what Link's up to. To the right, there's a Quick Fact Zelda 64 inches box. It's got some interesting little nuggets. Apparently you'll need to use the N64 controller buttons to play tunes on the ocarina, which makes sense. Holding A builds up power for your sword swipe. Good to know for dispatching those pesky enemies. And if Link's holding a staff, it slows him down from running. Realistic, I suppose. They also casually drop in that the D-pad is completely useless in the game, which is a bit strange, wonder why they did that. Say. It also talks about the Rumble Pack being only slightly compatible. According to Miyamoto himself, the item screen is described as a big cube, and you can rotate it with the joystick to see different screens on each face. Sounds a bit fiddly, but intriguing. They mention collecting medals, which is a Zelda staple, and you can equip items in the option cube to change Link's boots, clothes, sword and shield. Finally, the item screen lets you use items you've picked up. All standard Zelda stuff, but sounds like they are adding some interesting twists to the menus and items. Down in the corner, there's a little map in the bottom right of the screen which they say helps you get around. Always handy in a Zelda game, getting lost was half the fun, or frustration depending on your mood. And the whole page is titled Zelda: The Ocarina of Time, in massive letters, so yeah, it's definitely all about Zelda. Looks like they were pretty excited about it back then, January 1998, wasn't it? Can't blame them, it was a bit of a big deal at the time. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 11 it looks like, is having a proper chat about Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. It's an over to you section, so it's answering questions that readers had after seeing the game at some show in Tokyo. First off, they wanted to know what it looks like. Well, according to the mag, it's mind-blowing. Remember how games were back then? If they say mind-blowing, it must have been something else. They're raving about the animation, the controls and even the monsters, saying Zelda is in a different league. Bit strong, but we were all excited for this one, weren't we? Yee? Then there's the controls. Standard joystick for moving and aiming, L button for map, Z for targeting enemies, B for action, A to unsheath your sword, R to crouch, and the C buttons are for selecting your weapons and items. They mention a check function, which is a bit vague, and that the B button is multi-purpose. Up top of the screen you get a little menu showing your arrows and bombs, which is neat. Warrington, 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 over Link's head. Ah, that'll be Navi. Apparently, she's a sparkly will-o'-the-wisp character. Fancy. She helps you out when you're in trouble, like if you don't know what to do, or you're getting hammered by a monster. She'll give you hints and that. Sounds a bit like hand-holding, but maybe it's not too bad. Warrington that. Horses get a mention. Looks like you can ride a horse in the game to get around quicker. They reckon Miyamoto and his team have nailed the feel of riding a horse, which is good to know. B button whips the horse to jump over fences, bit of Black Beauty-esque Winnie they say. To keep the horse happy, you gotta give it a carrot. Otherwise, the RSPCA might have words. And there's something about a mysterious white horse you need to recapture. Sounds like a little side quest. Pekka, battles are covered next. Z trigger locks onto the nearest enemy, and while you hold it, Link focuses his attacks. Apparently, the camera goes widescreen during fights, and Link moves around the enemy. They seem quite impressed with this, reckons it adds a new dimension to the game, changing how you control Link. They also point out these flower enemies that can swing around, bite, and spit venom in your eyes. Tricky devils. Warranty ya. Finally, they talk about the time mechanism. At the show, they only had adult Link to play with, no kid Link, and because they only got 10 minutes of playtime, they couldn't really see how the day and night cycle worked properly. They did see night starting to fall though. Typical games show limitations. Ooh. And right at the bottom, live from Space World, they're talking about facing Dodongo, the big lizard. The trick is to wait for it to open its mouth and then lob a bomb in. Old school Zelda boss tactics right there. Fior. Seems like they were well impressed with what they saw, and to be fair, we all were buzzing for Ocarina of Time back then, weren't we? This page from Planet 64 is all about the upcoming Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time for the N64. It's titled Future Look, which is pretty apt as it's January 1998, and we were all eagerly anticipating this game. It seems they got to see a show game version at Space World, which sounds like Nintendo prepped a special demo so punters wouldn't get bogged down in a massive RPG in just 10 minutes. The article starts by detailing what weapons Link will have. We're talking your classic sword and shield, a bit obvious really, then a wooden staff which sounds a bit clunky but useful, a boomerang, catapult, and bombs standard Zelda fare. Apparently there are also these pachinko balls, Miyamoto mentioned, whatever they are. There's a bit about gameplay, saying it's focused on exploration and puzzles, and the jumping is automatic, which is a bit odd. No jump button? Interesting choice. They mention Z targeting, saying it's pressed here, pointing to the controller, and Link's movement is around the target. Sounds like a new way to control Link, could be good. Then there's a bit on game tours, which were parts of the show game. Hyrule was one, showing Link's treehouse and Hyrule Overworld, the usual landscapes. Dungeons was another, with puzzle scenarios. And then battles, which sounds like the most impressive bit. They saw fights against Stalfos, Goma and Dodongo, which sounds rather epic. Dodongo apparently is screen-filling, blimey. To beat Dodongo, apparently, you have to lob a bomb in his gob and then rush in with your sword. Sounds like a proper boss battle. Yeah. There's a funny little section about the two Links rumor, remember that? Apparently, it's not true, just one big Link sadly. And finally, the dreaded release date. It's been put back again, shocker. Japanese release in April. And as for a UK release, well, who knows when we'll actually get our hands on it. Still, it looks and sounds rather promising, doesn't it? They'll keep us updated anyway, they say, which is reassuring, I suppose. The screenshots look decent for the time, showing Link in action, some enemies, and the inventory icons at the top of the screen. This page is taking a first look at 1080 degrees snowboarding, Nintendo's brand new entry into the extreme sports genre for the N64. It seems to be quite a big deal, as they were showing it off at Space World 97. ZY, bless him, seems quite taken with the graphics, especially the speed and the details, mind you. It is the N64, so you'd expect a bit of a step up. They're even suggesting that Shigeru Miyamoto himself is going to teach Sony and Sega how to make a proper snowboarding game. Bit cheeky that. In it, there's a few screenshots dotted around showing off some downhill action, and apparently, all the stunts are in there, just really hard to pull off. There's even a mention of lens flare, fancy that, and they spotted a green bar in the HUD, but even these seasoned pros hadn't figured out what it was for. Two-player mode is mentioned but wasn't actually seen at the show. This is issue 11 of the magazine, so yeah, early days for the N64 really. This page from N64 Magazine, it's all about 1080 degrees snowboarding, Nintendo's new game for the N64. It's titled, Tactics from the Big and Boarding. Bit dramatic for a snowboarding game, innit? Seems like ZY, the reviewer, got an early look at it at the Space World show. Apparently it was a surprise reveal, coming from the Wave Race team. They reckon it's 80% done, aiming for a February release in Japan, which, yeah, lines up with the Winter Olympics back then. They mention it's going up against a fair few other snowboarding games like Nagano, Snowspeeder, Snowbo Kids, and Boss's Twisted Edge. Bit of a crowded market for snow, eh? ZY seems impressed with the Nintendo sheen of quality, right off the bat. You pick your snowboarder in a ski lodge, classic Nintendo style, and apparently, the controls are easy to pick up but still allow for some decent stunts. They're talking about pressing R, and using the joystick for 180s and 360s. using the B button for stunts in the air and A to hop. Holding Z makes you crouch, in the dip position they call it. There were 3 courses to play at the show, but they say there will be 6 courses and 3 extra snowboarders in the final game. They compare the game structure to wave race, so races, time trials and stunt modes are expected. They had a race against a time trial ghost, which sounds alright. ZY mentioned seeing plumes of powder snow and tracks left in the snow, which is superb, according to a little speech bubble. Very enthusiastic. They reckon it's quite an experience with alternative routes and tracks varying from wide to narrow. They even talk about the rumble pack subtly adding to the experience. Apparently the game is 80% complete, and they are working on a split-screen mode and a half-pipe stunt track. ZY thinks if Nintendo releases it in February as planned, 1080 Degrees might just be the definitive snowboarding game. A bold claim, let's see if it lives up to it. There are a few screenshots showing the gameplay. Looks pretty decent for the time, chunky polygons and all. Good times, good times. January 1998, N64 Magazine issue 11, if anyone is keeping score. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 11 it looks like, is all about F-Zero X. Right at the top it says, "At last! A chance to play the racer to end all." Races! Bit dramatic, innit? Seems like they're quite excited for it. Warrant! There's a load of screenshots dotted around. You can see the racing is proper fast. The speedometers are showing 729 km per hour, 567 km per hour, 634 km per hour, and even 818 km per hour in one of them. Blimey, that's nippy. Looks like they're showing different positions in a race. 25th, 12th, 13th, and even right down in 30th place. Ouch. Each screenshot has the little rankings on the left with the driver portraits, a bit like the old SNES game. Yeah, it's got that futuristic racer vibe for sure. Race. Down in the bottom left there's a box that says, "Live from Space World 97. Remember Space World? Seems like they saw it there, and were impressed with the speed, saying it's amazing and like the original SNES game, touching the side will send you ricocheting to your death. Charming. The main article text reckons no one's made a truly top-class racer on the N64 yet, but they mention Boss with Top Gear Rally and a claim with Extreme G as getting close. They're saying F-Zero X is going to be to the N64 what Wipeout and Ridge Racer were to the PlayStation. Big words. They were massive games back then, Wipeout and Ridge Racer. Proper system sellers. Payo. They talk about the controls being simple. A button to accelerate, B for boost, and Z and R to tilt the craft. 4 views to choose from apparently, controlled by the C buttons. And they mention that you can look backwards, which reverses the controls. Tricky. Boring to nonso has made buttons. The reviewer, someone called ZY pronounced Zai, they helpfully point out reckons you can race on any side of the big tube tracks, and your opponents are aggressive and don't mind barging you out of the way. Sounds about right for a futuristic racer. Overall, it seems like they're pretty hyped for F-Zero X. Comparing it to Wipeout and Ridge Racer is high praise indeed. Let's hope it lives up to it when it finally comes out. This page depicts a preview of F-Zero X. From the looks of things, it's a future look section, so we are getting the early buzz on this one. It seems to be a fair bit away still, as it mentions a Japanese release in June, and typically we'd have to wait even longer here in the UK, with the UK release marked as TBA. Typical UK way. They are talking about the speed, saying it feels smooth and fast, even with loads of racers on screen. Sounds like they are keeping the tough challenge from the original F-Zero on the SNES, which is good. Electrified track fences, ouch, those were nasty. They mention power-up grids, and going up to frightening 1000 km per hour speeds. Blimey, that's quick. Maya. Apparently, there are 18 courses in the show demo divided into Jack, Queen and King Cups, each with 6 circuits. And they even tease a mysterious question mark cup. Beyond that, maybe Ace Cup, like they are pondering? An eventual 24 courses in the final game is mentioned. That sounds pretty decent. The screenshots show some chaotic racing, with the player in 21st, 30th, 28th, 13th and 20th place. At various points doesn't look like they are having an easy time of it. Speeds of 670 km per hour, 624 km per hour, 552 km per hour, 600 km per hour, and even 649 km per hour are shown in the screenshots. They mention loop-the-loops and tubular tracks, which sounds pretty wild. Well. The reviewer, ZY, reckons it's only 60% finished and they are still tweaking the CPU cars. Sounds like it could be a tough racer, which is what you want from F-Zero really. They seem pretty impressed overall, saying it could be the best serious racer on the N64. Let's hope so. We could do with a decent futuristic racer. To be continued, it says at the end, promising more updates in future issues. Alright, I'll keep an eye out then. This page depicts a spread from issue 11 of N64 Magazine, dated January 1998. It's clearly a report from Space World 97, Nintendo's big show back in November. The headline screams, "Thousands to Space World 97, so you know it was a big deal." There's a photo of a massive crowd at the Makuhari Messe in Tokyo. Looks like a proper scrum of eager Japanese gamers waiting to get their hands on the N64's future. The article goes on about how Space World 97 was Nintendo's traditional November showcase, and how this year, all the games Nintendo hoped to release next year were on show. They reckon Nintendo's plans for the world were total and thoroughly deserved domination. A bit strong, but that's how it felt back then, wasn't it? The main image shows a snapshot of the show floor, with those big inflatable Nintendo characters floating above the crowds. You can just make out the screens showing off the games. There are also smaller images dotted around, including a scene from what must be Banjo-Kazooie, that rare game that was causing quite a stir with its graphics. Another screenshot is from Yoshi's Story, looking bright and colorful, typical Yoshi, and there's a little picture of what looks like a monkey playing a guitar, maybe Donkey Kong related? Tabah! The article mentions Banjo-Kazooie as the most impressive game, praising its graphical prowess. They also name-drop F-Zero X, NBA basketball, and 1080 degrees snowboarding as other notable debuts. Yoshi's Story gets a mention as well, described as brilliant, super fun. Sounds like they were pretty impressed across the board. Apparently, Nintendo boss Hiroshi Yamauchi was there, giving a speech about strategy, and Shigeru Miyamoto was also present, showing off Zelda, Ocarina of Time, and other top titles. The article says he took time to talk to the press, and N64 Magazine got a full report on page 70. Must have been a good interview. Further down, they talk about the 64DD Splash launch and Nintendo showing off Game Boy stuff as well, Pocket Monsters and new Game Boy add-ons like the Pocket Camera and Printer. They reckon these add-ons would be a big hit in Japan. Can't say I remember the printer being that popular over here though. Warrington no. On the left side of the page, there's the usual magazine masthead stuff, listing all the editors and contributors. Jonathan Davies was the editor back then, Will Overton the art editor, and so on. Good times reading these magazines, getting hyped for the next big N64 release. It's funny looking back now and seeing what games actually lived up to the hype, and which ones maybe didn't quite make the same impact as we thought they would at the time. This page depicts a typical newsy spread from N64 Magazine back in January 98. Right at the top, there's a shortcuts section. Seems like they're chuffed about Diddy Kong Racing doing really well over here and in the States, apparently shifting copies like hotcakes. Though, seems the Japanese weren't quite as bowled over by it, even if those reviewers at Tsushin gave it decent scores. Typical, eh? Then there's a bigger piece announcing the biggest N64 show of the year, when Nintendo unveiled their grand plans for 98. Sounds like everything was getting pushed back though, typical Nintendo. Mother 3, which everyone was hoping for at launch on the 64DD, was nowhere to be seen. Apparently, only Yoshi's Story escaped the delay curse out of the big names. Still, they reckon the games they did show off looked pretty good, especially to the Japanese who were still mad for anything Pocket Monsters related. Below that, there's a section titled Drive Away Away, about the 64DD itself. It seems Nintendo were changing their tune a bit on the 64DD, positioning it more as a Pokemon tie-in thing, and less of a revolutionary console add-on. They mention some Maker games, Talent Maker, Picture Maker and Polygon Maker, which sound a bit like creative tools using some special cartridge. Pocket Monsters Stadium is mentioned as the main game for the 64DD at launch, bundled with a special controller port and a 64GB packer, which is a bit confusing since it's floppy disks really. The idea was you could download your Game Boy Pokemon onto the 64DD and see them in 3D. Sounds a bit gimmicky if you ask me. They also mention F-Zero X getting DD content like extra tracks and editors, which is kinda cool. Apparently Nintendo weren't really pushing the 64DD games at this show, focusing more on their Beyond game stuff, whatever that meant. ZY, the reviewer, reckons the 64DD looks promising but still far off. On the side, there's an index to Space World 97 listing articles in this issue. Looks like coverage of Banjo-Kazooie, Zelda, Ocarina of Time, 1080 snowboarding, F-Zero X, all the 1998 games, Shigeru Miyamoto and Hiroshi Yamauchi interviews, and something called AZ of Space World. So, a good roundup of the show then. Visually there's a picture of that Banjo-Kazooie game looking rather colorful and jolly, a shot of the 64DD hardware itself with the controller, and a game screenshot that I guess is from one of those maker games. And of course Pikachu is there for some reason, probably because of the Pokemon time for the 64DD they were talking about. All in all, a snapshot of Nintendo's plans going into '98, lots of promises and delays as usual. This page from N64 Mag looks like we're in the new goods section. Always a treat to see what kind of plastic tat you could spend your pocket money on. First up, there's a bit about Argonaut, those Star Fox chaps, and their new game Buck Bumble. Sounds a bit daft, doesn't it? A B game. Apparently it's been revealed in N64 Magazine itself, bit of self-promotion there, and Ubisoft are publishing it. They mention the Birds and the Bees game from ages ago on the Spectrum, and Rimsky-Korsakov, fancy. Then there's a bit about some contraption called the Video Interactor, looks like a racing seat. £100 it costs. Says they haven't even tried it out properly, which is honest I suppose. Least favourite steering wheel is the LX4 apparently, which isn't a great endorsement. Over on the left, there's a fanzine farm section. Always interesting to see what the dedicated fans are up to. Retro Games fanzine gets a plug. Jason Moore puts it together. Sounds like a good read for old game trivia. Apparently it's packed with info and a list of every Game & Watch ever made, which is pretty comprehensive. You can order it for £2.50. Below that is N-Form fanzine. They featured it last month too. Seems like it covers old and new Nintendo stuff, NES, SNES, and N64. You can get it for £2 as well. Tour. There's also something called Roll Call, another fanzine. Seems very detailed and focused on RPGs. Apparently it's packed with RPG facts. Costs £4. So, moving back to the new goods, first up is the Shockwave by Daytel, a rumble pack. £25, bit pricey. Seems like it's been a while coming out. It's got a memory card built in, and a vibration pack, and even a microphone, which is a bit weird for a rumble pack, isn't it? Apparently the vibration is a bit erratic, and the microphone picks up noises. Not exactly state of heart then. Battery life is about 3 weeks apparently. They give it 91%, seems a bit generous. Next is the Joycard 64 inches by Hudson, Japanese import for about £15. Looks like a standard N64 controller but a bit smaller, with slightly smaller prongs, whatever they are. It's got auto fire and slow motion buttons, which are always a bit pointless, and an adjustable joystick which is a bit different. Apparently it helps with isometric games like Bomberman 64. They give it 76%. Not bad. Lastly, there are these 64 cassette cases, also Japanese imports, for £2.50. Remember those from N64 issue 1? They've collected the whole set. Basically plastic cases to keep your cartridges in, stackable, and you press a button to pop the cart out. They still can't see the point of them really, and reckon they'll keep Will quiet, whoever Will is. They give them 8%, harsh but fair maybe? Overall, a typical new goods page, some interesting bits and bobs, some a bit pointless, and all costing you your hard-earned cash. This page from Planet N64 Mag, must be back in '98, is having a look at some old-school gaming stuff. Right at the top there's a shout-out for gamers to get on some telly show called Games World. Sounds like they are after 100 brave souls to battle it out in a gaming tournament. Bit of a laugh if you fancied yourself a top player back then. Then they are looking at some bits and bobs for your N64. First up, the 64 Soft Rack, a Japanese thing for storing your game carts. For a mere 953 yen, or about £4. Looks alright, keeps the dust off, apparently. And then there's the 64 System Rack DX, a fancier Japanese storage unit for your whole N64 setup. Controllers, games, the console itself. That one's 3,180 yen, or about £15. Says it's safe and convenient storage, which is always reassuring. Moving on, there's a bit of a retro section kicking off with the Atari 2600, talking about how it was the big thing back in '80, and how computers and consoles were battling it out for Christmas sales, mentioning classic games like Combat, Space Invaders and Pac-Man. Apparently, Atari's still going, even in '98, and you could pick up a new 2600 for £99. Imagine that. Then we get into some game reviews. First, roller games for the NES. Apparently, it's a bit of a weird mix of games, but works okay, with smooth scrolling, and plenty to do. Music's good, Konami style, and it's tough, which is always a bonus if you don't want to finish it in 5 minutes. Next up is Galaxy 5000, also on the NES, from Activision. Racing game, but not much proper racing, more like changing lanes to avoid stuff. Controls are alright, music's good, 77% they gave it, not bad. Finally, there's Squish on the Game & Watch. Those double-screen Game & Watch machines were always a bit special, weren't they? Says they hadn't seen one before, felt excited opening it up. Bit dramatic. Apparently it's a good, addictive puzzle game on a single screen. 84% for that one, top marks for a Game & Watch. And at the bottom, retro rating, Jason Moore, the bloke writing all this retro stuff, gives his contact details if you want to get in touch about old games. Seems like he's running a retro fanzine. Good on him, keeping the old school flame alive. This page showcases a preview of Cruisin' World for the N64. Right then in '98, it was a bit of a follow-up to Cruisin' USA. The magazine seemed quite keen on it, saying it's meant to fix the issues from the previous game. Apparently Eugene Jarvis, who did Defender back in the day, is behind it, which is a name to be fair. They reckon the cars handle better, and the tracks are spread across 6 continents now, so you're not just stuck in the States. They mention driving through Aztec temples, Moscow, and even Egypt. Sounds a bit daft, in a good way, like the arcades used to be. There are some screenshots. One looks like you're driving through an aquarium, another is a bit more scenic with mountains, and the last one seems to be in China with flags and fire coming out of the exhaust. Health and safety gone mad, eh? It also mentions some other games coming this month for the N64, like Buggy Boogie, Power Slide, Reverend Limit, V-Rally 64, Grand Prix Race, NHL Breakaway 98, and Acclaim Sports Soccer. Standard fare really, a bit of everything for everyone. The reviewer, ZY, pronounced Zai, apparently doesn't sound overly hyped but seems to think it's a decent arcade-style racer, though not to expect anything too serious like a Gran Turismo rival. Fair enough, sometimes you just want a bit of daft fun, don't you? This page showcases a selection of driving games that were on the horizon back in '98 for the N64. We've got a feature titled, Eager Driving About Waiting, which is a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? Wick wick. First up is Power Slide. Apparently we saw some early pics after E3, but they're apologizing for them, bless them. It sounds like it's coming from an arcade game and then a PC version before it hits the N64. American developers too, which is always a bit of a gamble. They mention Dukes of Hazzard style driving, which might be fun, but who knows how it'll turn out. Then there's Rev Limit. Oh dear, sounds like it's had a bit of a kicking from Zai the reviewer. Apparently Nintendo of Japan are having to give it a good going over before Christmas. It might have 13 cars, but it was looking a bit ropey with speed, handling and the tracks. They mention another game, Wild Choppers, which I guess is from the same people, Seta. Sounds like Rev Limit needs some serious work. Next, V-Rally 64. This one's from those French bods, Ocean and Infograms. They're saying the PlayStation version had loads of tracks and proper cars, so fingers crossed the N64 version is decent, maybe even as good as Rage Racer, which is setting the bar pretty high. Finally, Grand Prix Race. Sounds like your straight-up F1 game coming from a Japanese developer and some American flight specialists, bit of an odd combo. They reckon it's a rival to the PlayStation F1 games, and hope it's better than F1 Pole Position, which wasn't exactly thrilling. Down at the bottom we've got Stunted Racer, and BUGGIE Boogie. This looks a bit more interesting, with a ladybird car in the screenshot. It's a Nintendo and Angel game, and they're keeping quiet about it apparently. It's coming out in Japan first in summer '98, and then autumn here. Seems like it's got a time attack mode and a battle mode against computer opponents. Miyamoto himself is keeping an eye on it, so maybe it'll be alright. They're hinting at multiplayer being a possibility too, which would be good. Gee. Overall, a mixed bag of driving games coming our way. Some sound promising, others, well, we'll have to wait and see, won't we? This page in the magazine is having a look at a couple of upcoming sports games for the N64. First up, it's NHL Breakaway 98, and they're saying it's looking pretty good, especially after the success of the PlayStation and PC versions. Apparently, this N64 one is being made over in America. They've got Keith Trakachuk, a big NHL goalie, endorsing it, and it sounds like they're packing it with detail motion capture, loads of stats, the works. They're even banging on about some total team management system where your players get points and improve, which sounds alright. They're making a point of saying the players will look like their real-life versions with these texture faces, which was a big deal back then, wasn't it? And the reviewer reckons it's looking less blurry than your average N64 game, which was always a bit of a bugbear. Rumour has it Tony Gubba might even be doing the commentary for the European version. Can't say I'm overly excited about that, but each to their own. Overall, they seem to think it should be good. Pretty understated praise there then. Then we move on to football, or soccer, as they insist on calling it sometimes. It's Acclaim Sports Soccer, and they're comparing it to FIFA 98 and ISS 64, which were the proper serious footy games back then. They mention Dynamite Soccer and 11-Beat as being a bit less serious, and say Acclaim's game is more in that category. Apparently they had an early version that was a bit rubbish and nearly got binned off before E3, but then they saw ISS 64 and had another go at it. They're talking up the player AI, how the team works together, and how the players react to what's going on. Apparently you get a load of camera angles to choose from. They're mentioning motion capture and fancy lighting, and seem to be wondering if it can actually be better than ISS-64, which is a pretty big ask. There's a little section called An Ear to the Ground, too, with some other bits of news. Apparently, Konami's Hybrid Heaven was a no-show at some Space World event, which is a shame, but they reckon Konami in Japan are working on something to rival Metal Gear. Solid, bit ambitious. Crystal Dynamics, who did Gex, are supposed to have loads of games coming, and DMA Design, who did Silicon Valley, are also mentioned as having something in the works. Someone called Interactive Studios, who did Fitaro and Clawn on the PlayStation, are apparently fiddling about with stuff for the N64 too, though it might be a while before we see anything. They also mention that Madden NFL 64 isn't doing as well as NFL Quarterback Club 98, but Acclaim's game is outselling EA's in America. And those Japanese mags weren't that impressed with Diddy Kong Racing, giving it decent scores but not raving about it like they did over here, which is a bit harsh. It was a laugh. Apparently Probe are already working on Extreme G2. They're wondering if it will be better or worse than Wipeout, which is the age-old question, isn't it? And a bit of gossip at the end, saying Rare aren't doing the Tomorrow Never Dies Bond game but maybe a general Bond game instead. Just some thoughts floating around, apparently. This page covers RPG news from Space World 97, which was a bit of a letdown for role-playing fans if you ask me. The main focus seems to be on Mother 3, or Earthbound 64 as some of us might have called it back then, for the Nintendo 64DD. Remember the 64DD? Nintendo were really pushing that disk drive. Woo woo woo. The headline is, Mario misses his mother, which is a bit cheeky, referring to the Mother series, not Mario's actual mum of course. It says Space World's come and gone, and asks if it delivered the role-playing goods. Seems the answer is a bit of a no. The article talks about how Mother 3 was the game everyone was expecting to see, the one to sell the 64DD. They thought it would give Nintendo credibility amongst Japanese RPG players. But, surprise surprise, it didn't make an appearance at Space World 97. Just some screenshots to keep the mother flag flying, as they put it. There are a few screenshots from Mother 3 on the page. One is of a fine saloon, which they say isn't really the Wild West in Mother 3's style. Another shows a battle scene with some rather odd-looking creatures, and hit points being displayed. Are those hit points on that meter, they ask? Someone's commented, so still no real speech conversations for Mother then? Which was a common thing for RPGs back then, wasn't it? The reviewer, Zai, mentions that Miyamoto had said earlier in the year that both the scenario and main game engine were pretty much done. But apparently, Nintendo PR said there was no reason why Mother shouldn't be at the show. Now its release date is floating in limbo, along with other non-Pokemon 64DD games. They end by wondering if Space World 98 will be any better for RPG fans wanting a real RPG from Nintendo. Sigh indeed. Oh, and there's a little box saying, disturbing is the only word we can think of to describe scenes like this one, about another screenshot, and another pointing out, Tim's favourite band Suede, make a guest appearance. Always a bit of weirdness with the Mother games, wasn't there? This page from N64 Magazine takes me right back to the anticipation of early 98, doesn't it? We're getting a sneak peek at Super Mario RPG 2 inches, can you believe it? It's for the 64DD, that thing we were all promised would be amazing but never quite materialized for most of us in Blighty. Apparently Mario is going all Flatlander in a 3D world, a bit like those trendy PlayStation games at the time. They're calling it a youngster's RPG, which sounds a bit condescending, doesn't it? The screenshots make it look pretty colourful, if a bit basic compared to what we were hoping for on the N64. Then we have the Ask Fusoya section. Good old ZY. Always had an opinion, didn't he? This bloke, John from Bristol, is asking the big questions about Zelda on cartridge versus 64DD. He's wondering if he should wait for the 64DD version of Zelda or just get the cartridge one when it comes out. And is the DD version different or cheaper? And when's it even coming? Fusoya, in his usual wizardly way, tells him to get the cartridge Zelda first, as the 64DD one is ages away. He reckons we'll have finished Ocarina of Time a dozen times before the 64DD version even shows up. Apparently this 64DD Zelda is going to be some kind of never-ending game that evolves over 18 years with yearly add-ons, like some sort of Tamagotchi for Zelda fans. And yeah, he thinks the DD version will probably be cheaper. As for when it's out, sometime in 1999 if we're lucky. Always vague, wasn't he, Fusoya? There are a couple of screenshots of Zelda, with Fusoya being a bit sarcastic about them showing Link getting the lamp in a dungeon chest, when any fool knows you get it in his house at the start of the game. Bit of a development shop blunder apparently. He ends by saying he'll be back next month with more RPG wisdom, and to avoid Gary Rhodes recipes. Good advice on both counts, I reckon. And then there's the address to send your letters to on a Viking funeral barge. Classic N64 Magazine humor. Ah, simpler times for gaming mags, eh? This page from N64 Magazine, issue 11, takes a look at a few things that were on gamers' minds back then. The first article is about American football games, which were getting a bit of attention over here thanks to EA and Acclaim. ZY, the reviewer, admits to actually liking American sports, even with all the razzmatazz and pom-poms. He mentions how exciting the games can be to watch as a spectator, even if he hasn't mentioned baseball yet. He's clearly looking forward to NFL Quarterback Club 98 and reckons it's going to be a highlight of the year. Fair enough, it did look quite good at the time. Next up is Street Play, where they're talking about games out and coming soon. Diddy Kong Racing is heavily promoted, but the reviewer isn't completely sold, saying it's a bit flat compared to Mario Kart 64, even if it might grow on you. They mention Sumo 64, Wild Choppers, for Mr. 64, and even a pachinko game coming out, which sounds a bit niche even then. Apparently there were 14 new games due in the next month, which in retrospect feels like ages ago when we were all waiting for the next big thing on the N64. Finally, there's a section on Pocket Monsters 2, which we now know as Pokemon Gold and Silver, though back then it was all very hush-hush. Nintendo PR were pushing it as even bigger than the first one, Pocket Monsters, or Pokemon Red and Blue as they became here. They list some new features like using a skateboard instead of just a bike, male and female monsters, monster breeding, a clock feature, loads more monsters, over 250 varieties, apparently new attacks and the ability to import your monsters from the first game, and something about Pippi evolving into Pippi Pixie, which I guess is what we now know as Clefairy evolving into Clefairy. It all sounded pretty amazing at the time, to be fair. Oh, and there's a bit at the bottom called Made in Japan with a picture of Max Everingham, who I guess was one of the team. This page depicts a typical page from a gaming magazine back in the day, probably around early 98, going by the mention of January. At the top left, there's a chart news section that's all about Japanese game sales. Apparently, Tamagotchi 2 on the Game Boy was still the top dog in Japan, selling loads. They mention Pocket Monsters, which we'd know as Pokemon, being second on the Game Boy chart, and Puyo Puyo Sun, 64, doing well on the N64. They're comparing N64 sales to the PlayStation, mentioning Namco Antique Collection and All Japan Pro Wrestling games on the PSX, which were doing alright, but Tamagotchi was clearly king at that point. Next to that, there's a piece called Yoshi's Story Update. Seems like they've got some new screenshots for Yoshi's Story, which was a highly anticipated game back then. They talk about the game being like a storybook and mention collecting 30 white dots that turn into fruit. Sounds pretty standard platformer fare, maybe a bit cutesy for some. Chaitan. Below that is M2 Born Again. This section is talking about the M2, which I vaguely remember was some sort of console or tech that was supposed to be really powerful. Apparently it was shown at some Com Japan show, and was meant for businesses now instead of just games. They mention Matsushita, which is Panasonic, and reckon it might be too pricey for most people and better to stick with the N64. Bit of tech industry news, I guess. On the right-hand side, the main article is An Englishman in Tokyo, Rich Pickings. This is written by someone called ZY, and it's about the crazy amount of packaging you get with stuff in Japan, especially games. He starts off talking about free TVs and microwaves being dumped in Tokyo. He then goes on about Japanese recycling and how everything has to be separated. He mentions seeing a shop assistant in Japan really overwrapping a fork, and questions if all the wrapping for games is really necessary. He talks about N64 cartridges being tough and not needing loads of packaging like CDs. He ends up saying he'd be happy with just a simple plastic box like Game Boy games, suggesting it would be better for the planet whilst still looking decent to consumers. Finally, at the bottom left is a Learn Japanese box, which is a regular feature I remember. It's teaching some basic Japanese phrases related to shopping, like asking for the price, asking without the box, saying you don't need packaging, and what recycle is in Japanese. Handy if you were importing games or going to Japan, I suppose. This page from N64 Arena Magazine, issue 11 it looks like, is all about their review section and how they score games. The big splash is for San Francisco Rush. There's a screenshot of the game with one of those polygonal cityscapes, and a car mid-race, classic arcade racer vibes for the N64. They've got this guide to scoring section, explaining their review process. It says N64 games were pricey, so they only give their Star Game medal, that's the star logo there, to games they've properly played through. Sounds fair enough, you wouldn't want to drop 50 quid on a duffer back then. They've got a colour-coded ball system for scores, a bit like traffic lights. Gold ball for 85% and above, which is Star Game territory, only for the real cream of the crop. Purple ball for 84% to 70%, meaning superb, still jolly good fun and worth considering. Green ball, 69% to 50%. They say it's perfectly playable and everything, but just isn't special. A bit lukewarm, really. Then red, 49% to 20%, lazily programmed or hurriedly cobbled together. Ouch, harsh. And finally grey for 19% to 0%, which they haven't even seen yet thankfully, and hope they never do, promising to punish it ruthlessly if they do. Bit dramatic. Ick, 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 pick, hick, 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 pick, pake, heifer, for serious reviewing, making sure people know they're not just slapping stars on anything and everything. San Francisco Rush is getting the big treatment it seems. Probably a decent game back in the day, all those crazy stunts and city racing, quite a spectacle, on the N64. This page from N64 Magazine takes me right back to January '98. It's got a section called Import Arena, showing what games are causing a stir in America and Japan. They've listed a few titles, kicking off with Aerofighters Assault vs Wild Choppers. Sounds like some aerial combat game face-off. Then there's 64 Osumo. Can't say I was ever massively into sumo wrestling on the N64, but Max Goes All Wobbly is a funny tagline. Wheel of Fortune, yeah? Figures? Even quiz shows made it to the console. WCW vs NWO World Tour. Now that's more like it. Wrestling was huge then, although I always preferred WWF myself. Famista 64 inches and MK Mythologies, Sub-Zero round it off, the latter being another Mortal Kombat spin-off. They were milking that franchise for all it was worth back then. Then you've got the How It Works bit explaining their review system, with the Team 64 inches reviewers. They're breaking down the scores into visuals, sounds, mastery and lifespan, leading to an overall verdict. Seems pretty standard stuff for a game review really. Team 64 inches themselves are a bunch of lads and lasses giving their opinions. Jonathan Davies apparently doesn't know what Tergiversate means, bless him. Andrea Ball hasn't got a clue about the word Phaeton. Will Overton's talking about Mahjong and bamboo, which seems a bit random. Paul Jarrald is wondering if Phaeton is a Mario Kart secret. Clutching at straws a bit there, mate. James Ashton was jet-lagged and moved on to Tim Weaver, who shouted at MK Mythologies, Sub-Zero. Jez Bickham, the dictionary-brained one, reckons Phaeton is a horse-drawn carriage which is quite specific, and ZY Nicholson, pronounced Zai, by the way thinks it's some South American fruit dance. Game of the Month shoutouts are sprinkled around, with 64 Osumo and Wild Choppers getting mentions, along with Yoshi's Story, San Fran Rush, and WCW vs NWO Oging. Overall, it's a typical preview page, hyping up some import titles and explaining their scoring system, with a bit of light-hearted banter from the review team about some word they don't understand. Takes me back to reading these mags and wondering if these import games were worth the extra quid. This page depicts a look at San Francisco Rush on the N64. Seems like they covered it before back in issue 8 if you can remember that far back. It was all a bit blurry then, wasn't it? Anyway, this time it's a proper look at the game as it's out now. Chachi. They've got a few screenshots, showing the usual arcade racer madness. Cars flying through the air and tearing up the tarmac. One bit mentions a black VW camper van opponent being a bit of a pain, always trying to shunt you off the road. Charming. There's even a picture of the van driving across the roof of a skyscraper, because why not? It's San Francisco Rush, supposed to be a bit bonkers. They are also banging on about skids being a big part of the game, saying every corner leaves a black mark. Right, we get it, it's about fast cars and going sideways, very good. Looks like it's out now, and they're saying it's 60 quid. 60 quid? In '98, that's a fair whack for a game, isn't it? Still, I suppose if you wanted a bit of arcade racing silliness on your N64, this was probably the ticket. Rumble Pack compatible too, for that extra bit of oomph when you crash, naturally. This page from N64 Magazine, January '98 it seems, is having a look at San Francisco Rush for the N64. Right then, what do we have here? So first off, they're saying San Francisco Rush isn't your typical racer. No kidding. It was all about the massive jumps and dodgy physics, wasn't it? Defying gravity, they say. And still, it's all fun. Yeah, in a slightly chaotic who knows what's going to happen next kind of way. They mention Top Gear Rally as being more serious, and Rush as being this more adventurous, maybe slightly unintentional mess of corkscrew mid-air stunts. Fair enough. Then there's a bit called Wheels of Fortune, breaking down the cars into beginner, advanced, expert and extreme categories. Beginner cars, like the VW Camper and BMW, are apparently heavy and easier to control, good for shunting opponents off the track. Advanced are middling, Dodge Viper and Pontiac Firebird, Good acceleration but rubbish on grass. Expert cars VW Beetle and Corvette are swervy, good for secrets, but prone to skidding. And extreme, just Ferrari, are quick, very fast, but braking is a nightmare and difficult to control, especially at speed. Sounds about right, the faster you go the harder it is to stop, who'd have thought it? Lastly, there's a You're Cheating car section, always useful back in the day, eh? They're giving away cheat codes for practice mode. Auto abort disable, infinite time, and resurrect in place. Standard stuff really, for getting to know the tracks or just messing about without the time running out. Handy if you were stuck, I suppose. Kaya. So yeah, San Francisco Rush. Bit of a laugh, wasn't it? Not exactly Gran Turismo, but good for a bit of arcade-style silliness on the N64. ZY, or Zai as they say to pronounce it, seems to think it's decent enough. Probably worth a rent from Blockbuster on a Friday night. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 11, takes us back to January 1998 and is all about Beetle Adventure Racing. On the N64, a game I vaguely remember renting from Blockbuster. It looks like a track guide, split into Track 1 and Track 2. Track 1 is called Breakdown, and seems like a fairly straightforward easy track at 2.6 miles, with a decent elevation change. The layout detail mentions the Golden Gate Bridge and suggests it's based in San Francisco, starting on the bridge and heading into the city outskirts. Track 2, also called Breakdown, is longer at 3.4 miles, rated medium difficulty, and still set in San Francisco. This one focuses more on city driving, with parks, right-angled corners, and rooftop jumps, so sounds a bit more interesting than the first track, which is described as fairly simple, except for a nasty section across grassland. Grassland in San Francisco? Right you are, Rack. Then we get to Golden Keys, which I suppose are like collectibles in the game. For Track 1, the guide shows 4 keys. The first is in a tunnel, requiring a 180-degree turn at the start. Cheeky. The second is mid-air near a tunnel exit, requiring a ramp jump. The third is in a wall tunnel, after a lap, and the fourth is after a crowd-filled grandstand. Sounds like they're trying to spice up these easy tracks. Track 2 Golden Keys seem a bit more involved. Key 1 is behind a cordoned-off area, red cones, naturally where you need to drop off the road onto a broken section, turn around and find it. Key 2 is on a bridge, requiring good speed and braking to land on a lower platform. Sounds fiddly. Finally, there are alternative routes for both tracks. For Track 1, there's a fence you can drive through into grassland to cut a corner, and a tunnel offshoot for another shortcut. For Track 2, there's a sewer shortcut after a corner, and another shortcut through a cordoned-off area involving a jump back onto the main track. The last one even mentions Mace the Dark Age, written on a lorry ramp which sends you to a rooftop area. A bit of a weird cross-promotion there, probably some publisher link-up. Overall, it's your typical track guide, showing off the secrets and shortcuts in Beetle Adventure Racing. Standard stuff for a racing game guide back then, trying to find every advantage to shave off those seconds. Not bad for a quick flick through if you were stuck on a track back in '98. This page depicts a guide for San Francisco Rush on the N64, classic arcade racer that one. Looks like we've got tips for Track 3 and Track 4. For Track 3, which they're calling Breakdown, it seems like it's a harder track, going through the city and up into the hills, with lots of jumps. Sounds about right for Rush, didn't they all have ridiculous jumps? The Golden Keys section is all about finding hidden keys on the track. The first one is apparently near the first corner, hidden behind some trees, and a ramp that leads onto a rooftop, typical sneaky stuff. Another one is above the second checkpoint sign, needing a good run up to get it. Then in Chinatown there's a key if you go straight on instead of around a left turn, ending up in a car park. Finally, after the 8th checkpoint, you need to keep left and jump onto a veranda to find the last key, which is near a skyscraper. Sounds like a bit of a treasure hunt, those Golden Keys, exactly what we were into back then, hunting for all the secrets. Then for alternative routes, on Track 3, they're showing some shortcuts. Instead of turning left at the first corner, you can go straight into a tunnel. Apparently there's a break in the scenery after the second checkpoint that takes you through a village. And after the 8th checkpoint on the grass, there's a sewer that cuts out a quarter of the track. Cheeky. Moving on to Track 4, Breakdown here says it's easier, mostly city-based, but still maze-like with chances to get lost. They say it's good for practice if you're struggling, cause you know who actually read practice tips. For the Golden Keys on Track 4, the first one is hidden in a fenced-off area near the first corner. You need to use a memorial park as a ramp to get to it. Bit elaborate. The second key is also in the memorial park, high up in the air. The third one is at the end of a flyover. You've got to go very slowly on a walkway type thing to get to a car park where the key is. And the last one is near a park. You have to find a gap in a wall and maintain a speed of about 80 miles per hour to get to it, apparently on the second level of a building. More hidden keys, more sneaky routes, that was the name of the game. Ease near a pyre. Alternative routes. For track 4, start with following arrows after the fourth corner to a grass bank that launches you into an adjacent tunnel. They even mention you can't do it in mirror mode, which is a bit specific. Then on the right after the first alternative route, there's a bus reversing out of a building gap that leads to a tunnel. And where the track forks, you go right to find a gap in the road leading through a grassy tunnel to the finish, anything to cut down those lap times, right? Finally, for the fourth golden key, there's a choice of routes, one using a ramp and another a rooftop track at 140 miles per hour. Ambitious. It's all about finding those little edges, wasn't it? These guides were gold dust back then, figuring out how to shave seconds off your best time and impress your mates. ZY, the reviewer, seems to be giving us the inside scoop. Happy days. This page from N64 Magazine is all about getting the most out of a racing game. Looks like a guide for secrets and alternative routes in a couple of tracks. It's got track 5 and track 6 detailed here. Track 5, Breakdown, is set in San Francisco. Apparently quite tricky to find all the secrets in this one. The reviewer ZY reckons there's loads still hidden, even after finding a couple of keys and alternative routes. Track 6, Breakdown, is described as moving away from the city and getting into more open areas, with grass and water, hairpin bends and even buses to watch out for. Sounds like a right laugh, if a bit chaotic. Back then we were used to things being a bit rough around the edges on the N64. Wasn't always super polished like these modern games. For both tracks there are sections on golden keys. Everyone was always mad for collecting everything back then, weren't they? For track 5, the guide tells you how to use glass panels and ramps to get the first key, a red brick path for the second, and something to do with a fuel station for the third. Sounds a bit cryptic, but that was part of the fun, wasn't it? Figuring it out yourself, or with your mates. For track 6, golden keys, the first one's in a fenced-off cove, the second after a hairpin bend near a tree-lined park, the third involves going down a bank and through a hole in a wall, and the last one is near a danger sign and a loop-the-loop. Sounds like a right old adventure just collecting these keys. Then there's alternative routes for both tracks. For track 5 it mentions arrows and a gap in hoardings leading to holiday villas and a beach, though ZY isn't convinced it's that helpful, maybe just a bit of fun exploring. The second route option involves a top-level tunnel and another route with lava and spikes. Typical game craziness of the time. Track 6 alternative routes include a lighter grey part of a wall with a tunnel, a cross-country route after a bump and a river bridge, and another route involving a steaming great park and a jump over a river to avoid a bend. It's all good stuff for exploring the tracks and showing off to your mates. You knew all the shortcuts and secrets. These guides were always brilliant back in the day. You'd pore over them for ages trying to figure everything out. This page is a review of San Francisco Rush for the N64 from back in the day. It seems the Americans were proper raving about it, with one of their magazines even calling it the third best N64 game, just after Super Mario 64 and GoldenEye. Bit much really, getting ahead of themselves as usual. I mean, better than Mario Kart, Wave Race, even ISS 64? Bit of a stretch. Meh. The reviewer, Tim Weaver, reckons it's alright, inventive and fast, but maybe doesn't quite have the polish when it comes to showing off the N64's graphical grunt. Apparently there's a lot of fog in the game and some dodgy textures on the trees. He also mentions the brakes are a bit rubbish, and the handling isn't the best, especially around corners. Mind you, there are secret shortcuts, which is always good fun in a racer. There's a bit about cheat codes too, for getting rid of the fog, and for making it a foggy night, which sounds like messing about with the colours, to be honest. Apparently the music's a bit pants. He calls it the worst in any game. Bit harsh maybe? Mastery gets a decent score, saying it's fast and uses 32-bit with anti-aliasing, whatever that means really. Smooths the edges, I suppose. Lifespan gets a good score too, reckons there's loads to unlock, and the two-player is good. Warrantia. Visually it gets an 8, but he says it's fuzzy and foggy, but if you forget that it's alright. Sounds get a 1 ouch. Mastery a 6 and lifespan a 9. Overall, the verdict is 82%, saying it's not serious racing like Top Gear Rally, but still fun and entertaining enough. So not amazing then, but not terrible either. Sounds like a rental at least. This page showcases a preview of Aero Fighter's Assault for the N64, back in issue 11 of N64 Magazine. It's under the Import Arena section, because as usual, we Brits are going to be waiting a bit longer than the lucky Japanese and Americans to get our hands on it. Apparently, these developers Paradigm used to make serious flight simulators for military types, and now they're bringing their expertise to the N64. The reviewer, some bloke called Zai, Reckons it's trying to be a proper flight sim but without all the boring bits, you know, like actually taking off properly and landing without crashing. They've cut out all that tedious stuff apparently, just straight into the action. Looking at the screenshots, it's got your typical polygonal N64 look, nothing too mind-blowing visually, but that city does look alright, and apparently, you can blow it up, which is always a bonus. There's a shot of a space shuttle taking off too because, well, 98% of N64 games seem to have one of those shoehorned in somewhere, don't they? Classic N64 games. The game sounds like you're flying around in F-14 Tomcats, launching loads of missiles, and taking on bad guys with futuristic tanks and robots. Bit over the top, isn't it? You even get wingmen to help you out, though if they get shot down you miss out on gold stars, so cheers for that, mates. They mention 7 basic missions, plus bonus ones if you're good enough to get gold stars. Sounds like your typical arcade-style flight shooter really. Says explosions are thick and fast and hopefully, you get to blow up more than just your own vehicles, which is a mildly amusing thought. Price-wise they are saying about $60, so around 40 quid import price, which isn't too bad if it's any good. We'll have to wait and see when it eventually makes it over to Blighty, but it might be a decent shout for some aerial blasting on the N64. This page showcases a review of the game Wild Choppers for the N64. It's part of the Import Arena section. The page has got a big bold title, Wild Choppers, and a large orange letter S. That's a bit of a stylistic choice from the magazine, I suppose. There's a game info box that tells you it's by Seta, a Japanese game, already out in Japan, but TBA for the UK. 64 megabit cartridge, Rumble Pack compatible, and it's about 6,800 yen, which they reckon is about 30 quid. 30 quid for an import game back then, blimey, that's a bit steep. Warrington Norsa, you can see a few screenshots of the game itself. It looks like a helicopter combat game. Very polygonal. You know, typical N64 style. There are explosions and bits flying about, targeting reticles, and some terrain that looks a bit basic. One shot shows a helicopter going down in flames, another has some buildings and tanks. It's all very much of its time, isn't it? Voodoo. The review text starts off by saying, there's no getting away from it. Wild Chopper's control system is unique among N64 games, which doesn't exactly fill you with confidence, does it? It mentions it's different to Turok or GoldenEye controls. Apparently the D-pad moves you around, and the joystick aims. Seems a bit backwards to be honest, but they say you get used to it after an hour or two. It's compared to Desert Strike or Thunderhawk, which were decent enough games on older consoles, so they're setting the bar somewhere around there. They talk about objectives like destroying radar towers, rescuing POWs, and even escorting a plane on one level. Sounds like your typical mission-based helicopter game. There are a couple of little tip boxes as well. One says, take out defending artillery before attacking other stuff, or you find a missile embedded in your chopper. Good advice, I suppose, obvious really. Another one says, you'll need to master the art of circle strafing. Circle strafing in a helicopter game? Alright then. And another tip says, be sure not to hit the president's plane by mistake. It's in enough trouble as it is. President's plane? Right then. Sounds a bit daft. And finally, sadly you can't blow up the friendly rescue Chinook. Spoil sports. Typical game reviewers, always wanting to cause trouble. The reviewer, someone called ZYZI they pronounce it, apparently seems a bit lukewarm on it all. They mentioned the hardware is completely made UP, and the helicopter and tank designs are thoroughly amusing. Not exactly high praise, is it? They finish by asking, but is it better than Aero Fighters? Or worse? Let us see. Which is hardly a ringing endorsement. Sounds like they're not blown away, but maybe it's a bit of alright if you're really into your helicopter games, and don't mind a weird control system. This page is about Aero Fighters Assault on the N64, taking us back to simpler times, eh? It's got a bit of an overview calling it Aero Bits, catchy I suppose. The page is selling us on 7 missions, and some bonus ones if you're good enough. To getcha. First up, it talks about pick a plane, saying there's 4 planes to choose from in Aero Fighters, each with its strengths and weaknesses, naturally. They all have a couple of main weapons, a defensive one, and a special weapon, fancy that. They list the planes, F-14B Tomcat, piloted by Hawk, which they reckon is their aircraft of choice, with Phoenix missiles that lock on to 4 targets at once, and a special weapon of Tomahawk cruise missiles. Sounds a bit tasty, that does. Gorrington by Hawk. Then there's the A-10, a Thunderbolt, with Glenda at the controls. They say it's tough and can take a beating, but otherwise useless charming. Its weapons are guided bombs, so you've got to aim them apparently, and it's supposedly rubbish at air-to-air combat. Noted. Next is the Su-35 Superflanker, piloted by Volk. They're not too keen, saying its main weapon, the fire arrow missile, is rubbish. But the special weapon, a shockwave thing that murders anything in its path, is fun apparently. Bit dramatic, aren't we? Finally, the FSX, with Hien as pilot, generally useless with awful missiles, but it has a ninja beam special weapon, which can apparently knock off 2/3 of a boss's energy in one go. Crikey. Then they run through 6 missions quickly. Mission 1. Tokyo is flooded, and you're fighting a giant robot walker and enemy fighters. Mission 2. Pacific Ocean is a giant submarine mothership to blow up, watch out for planes and ships. Mission 3. Air battle, set in New York, with bombers and fighter cover. Mission 4. Desert, classic desert level, attacking tanks and making sure not to forget what your target is. Helpful. Mission 5. Shuttle defense. Defending a shuttle apparently, it's the first mission without a boss, and it's about defending it from enemies. Mission 6. Fortress, getting tougher now. Fighting around force fields guarding an arms factory at night. Over on the right, there's a section called Looks and Sounds. They say the N64 is used to having loads of graphics on screen, and Paradigm, the developers, have gone for ground targets rather than just blue sky, probably a wise move. They mention some levels look smashing, especially the desert with archways of rock. They reckon the baddies are brilliant, super detailed and mean looking. Alright, calm down. They talk about special effects, smoke trails, building explosions, and glare from the sun. Sounds like they're trying to sell it. They even compare it to Wild Choppers, saying Wild Choppers has good smoke trails too, but generally, Aerofighters is agreed here at N64 Magazine to be second best graphics-wise. Ouch, second best? The reviewer, someone called ZY, pronounced Zai, apparently thinks the scenery in Wild Choppers is a bit muddy and boring, but you can see little polygonal soldiers running around on the ground, which Aerofighters doesn't have, and Wild Choppers has a smooth frame rate thanks to fogging apparently. Aerofighters apparently ranges from acceptable to juddery when lots is going on. Sound-wise they reckon Wild Choppers wins outright, with music from the rock soundtrack that all flying games must include, bit sarcastic there, and amazing guitar solos. Aerofighters' music is rather more nondescript, and has radio voice samples that get annoying. Especially the phrase, bummer, that's bogus. Sounds like they're not too impressed with the sound then. This page in N64 Magazine, issue 11 back from January 1998, dives into Wild Choppers, a game they reckon is a bit tricky to get your head around. It's all about helicopter combat, and they've got a section called Wild Things, going through the first 5 missions out of 8. Looks like they've got 5 missions detailed here. Radar attack, where you're taking out radar dishes. POW rescue, involving transport planes and freeing prisoners. Presidential escort, where you're protecting the president's plane. More POWs, which seems to be rescuing more prisoners from defended buildings. And tunnel assault, set in a maze of tunnels with oil rigs and a boss at the end. Sounds like the missions get progressively harder. They mention you can choose from 8 different helicopters, and the page shows a choose a chopper section with options like Sky Turbo and Whale 32. They even joke that they mostly went with the crap Firecat for some reason, but maybe they should have picked the Whale 32, which can take more damage. Wise words there, probably learnt the hard way. There's a select weapons bit too, showing you can choose rockets and other bits and bobs to equip your chopper. Apparently, each chopper has a limited number of weapon slots, and you buy more weapons with money earned from missions. Standard stuff really. They talk about the controls, saying once you get the hang of rotating. Sounds a bit daft, doesn't it? Morrington circle strafing, it's actually pretty fun zooming around, popping up from behind hills and launching missiles. They do mention it can get annoying in narrow valleys when you keep crashing into walls. We've all been there with flight games on the N64, haven't we? Apparently there's even a Rambo character who can jump on your helicopter and mess with your controls if you fly too low. Sounds a bit mad, typical N64 era silliness. They reckon the guided missiles work well, better than in Aerofighters, which they describe as a more serious game. Wild Choppers sounds like it's trying to be a bit more arcadey and less sim-like then. There's a tiny Japanese control diagram which they say isn't much help. Probably right about that. Wild Japanese Warrington Fukra. Overall it sounds like Wild Choppers is a decent enough blast if you can get past the controls and maybe put up with a bit of wall bouncing frustration. Looks like the magazine were giving it a fair go anyway. This page from N64 Magazine, harking back to issue 11, is all about Aerofighters Assault, which, if memory serves, came out around Christmas 97 or early 98. It's got this headline, The Secret of Our Success, which sounds a bit grand for what turns out to be basically a cheat to make the game easier. Apparently in Aerofighters you can just crash into buildings without dying, which the magazine is calling a quirk that turns a really tough game into a walk in the park. They're saying the key to winning is to just fly straight at the bosses, guns blazing, then crash into them, get respawned, and repeat until they're blown up. A bit cheesy really, but hey, we weren't exactly spoiled for choice back then, were we? War. Then there's a looks and sounds bit comparing it to Wild Choppers. They reckon both games are tough to start with, but Wild Choppers rewards skill, whereas Aero Fighters relies on this exploit they've just described. They say Aero Fighters is more of a cheat than proper gameplay, which kinda kills the point. They moan that even the first level of Aero Fighters is a bullet hell, and you get hit without even knowing what's shooting at you. Sounds about right for some of these N64 titles, bit rough around the edges. Gal. There's a scoring section. Visuals get a 7, sounds a 4. Apparently supermarket music charming. Mastery a 5, and lifespan a measly 3. The overall verdict is 60%, which is, well, distinctly average. The reviewer, ZY, sums it up as good looking and with a pleasing feel, but there's not enough to do in it. Pretty lukewarm praise, to be honest. Oh, and there are cheat codes mentioned too. Extra plane gives you access to a couple of bonus planes using a button combo on the title screen, and change color lets you change your plane's color by pressing R at the plane select screen, which is groundbreaking stuff, obviously. They also have a bit about the two-player mode being okay, but you can't really dogfight properly, just circle each other until someone gets bored. Sounds thrilling. All in all, Aero Fighters Assault doesn't sound like a classic, but probably worth a rent from Blockbuster back in the day if you were desperate for something new to play on your N64. This page reviews Wild Choppers for the N64. It's an import arena page, so it's likely a Japanese game that's been brought over. There's a section called rotating that explains the game's control system, comparing it to Doom and the circle strafe technique. Apparently you have to move sideways while keeping your guns on target, which sounds a bit fiddly, typical of some of these import titles. It mentions hovering before firing with the Z button and using rockets. Nothing too groundbreaking there. There's a bit about accessibility, noting it's not like Aero Fighters Assault, which was very American, and in Wild Choppers the storyline isn't much to worry about. You can easily figure out the missions, which is probably just as well for an import. War. The verdict section is interesting. The reviewer, Jonathan Davies, says neither game is perfect, and not up to the standard of top N64 games, but they both look alright and offer plenty to do. Aero Fighters Assault is mentioned as being fun sometimes, especially for missile attacks from behind sand dunes or taking on giant bombers. Wild Choppers is described as more of a shoot-'em-up, requiring planning and power-ups, and having helicopter combat. They've given Wild Choppers a score of 79%, and broken it down into categories with little icons. Visuals get a 6, saying it looks primitive but has good effects and smooth movement. Sounds get an 8, praising the music and explosions. Mastery is a 5, suggesting it's about as easy as a PC or PlayStation game, whatever that means. Lifespan gets a 6, saying it's easy to get through but missions are replayable. Finally, Replay just says it has good controls and plenty to blow up, which is what you want in a chopper game apparently. Overall it's a decent score, seems like a fun but not amazing import title. Probably worth a look if you were into helicopter games at the time, but not exactly a system seller. This page from N64 Magazine must be from back in the day, yeah, issue 11 it says, and it's giving the once over to 64 Osumo. Remember that one? Nintendo 64 of course, because what else would it be reviewing in N64 Magazine? Blimey, look at that score, 90%! They really rated it, didn't they? Accessibility is flagged as a bit tricky for us Brits if you don't know your Japanese, which was often the way with these imports back then. Visually they've given it a 9, reckon it looks just like the Sumo on telly, which, fair enough, it sort of does with those chunky graphics. Sounds get an 8, apparently the announcer is spot on, and there are worrying squelching sounds which, intriguing. Mastery is a 7, easy to pick up, hard to master, like skiing they reckon, bit of an odd comparison that one. Lifespan is a 9, lasting longer than a sumo wrestler's career, apparently. And the verdict is pretty strong, saying it might be niche, but if you're into sumo it's heaven, maybe even better than the real thing. Bit strong now, aren't they? Looking at the screenshots, it's all chunky polygons, proper N64 style. One caption is poking fun at the size of the wrestlers at a dopa testing session, ha! Another one says it's not Zelda beating, but has an RPG element, which must be the story mode they mention later. They talk about different wrestler types and loads of moves, all controlled with the 3D stick and C buttons. Sounds simple enough, but I bet getting good was the trick. And it was out now, apparently costing around 27 quid back then. Blimey, games were pricey. Reviewer is Max Everingham, signing off as a big sumo fan, so he's clearly biased, but 90% is still a stonking score, innit? This page shows a rather brutal review of the Wheel of Fortune game on the N64. It's from N64 Magazine back in January '98, can you believe it? They've given it a measly 17%, which pretty much tells you everything. Looking at the screenshots, it's Wheel of Fortune alright. You've got the wheel, the letters, and a very 2D looking Vanna White who apparently cankans across the screen. Remember FMV on the N64? Not exactly cutting edge stuff even then. The reviewer, Tim Weaver, isn't pulling any punches. He calls it a hideous pile of molded offal, and reckons it's as much fun as falling into a vat of industrial strength acid. Charming. They've rated it poorly across the board. Visuals, sounds, mastery, lifespan. Pretty much everything's got the lowest score possible. Apparently the audience sounds like they're clapping in a cave, and the graphics are so bad they could turn you to stone. Harsh, but probably fair enough for the time, if it was truly awful. It mentions Gamatech as the developer, 64 meg cartridge, for 1 to 3 players, and even lists the price at $55, which was about £35 back then. That was a lot of money for a game back then, especially for something they're calling criminally priced. There's even a little box saying the best thing about it is the full motion video, which is clearly sarcastic, as N64 FMV was never a highlight. And there's a comment about how at least we still have Jeopardy to look forward to, signed off with, Bang Ed, which is quite funny. So yeah, overall, a proper panning for Wheel of Fortune. Sounds like one to avoid, even for us nostalgic types. It definitely reminds you that not every game from that era was a classic, and magazines back then weren't afraid to say it straight. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 11, looks at WCW vs NWO World Tour on the N64. It's a wrestling game, as you can probably guess from the massive WCW vs NWO World Tour headline in big red and yellow letters. The review starts off by saying to slip on that leotard, perfect those growls, and get ready to parade your hands of death, as the WCW takes on the NWO, FAB. Which is a bit dramatic even for wrestling back then, wasn't it? They're talking about Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, Kevin Nash, Sting and Rey Mysterio Jr. They are all name-dropped in the text, saying they've got stupid names and ludicrous fighting suits. Bit harsh lads, but alright. There are screenshots of the game itself, blocky graphics as you'd expect from the N64 at the time, with wrestlers grappling in the ring and doing all sorts of moves. One screenshot has a comment saying, "Could you just put your head back, sir? That's better. Now if I just pull excessively at your chin, it might come loose." Typical wrestling commentary humor. Another one says, "A punch. Unspectacular but, ultimately, just what the doctor ordered." And another, "Tag match. Fun that the whole family can enjoy." Right you are. They say the camera is alright, and the controls are easy enough to use. Apparently, there are 37 fighters to choose from WCW, NWO, and some other federations. It mentions 4-player slapdowns, which were always a laugh with mates. They compare it to the PlayStation version WCW vs the World, saying the N64 visuals are better, smoother and quicker, which is what you wanted to hear at the time, wasn't it? Cheshire. The little box in the corner shows it was out now in Japan and the US and coming in February for the UK. It uses 64 MB of memory, supports 1 to 4 players, controller pack and rumble pack, and would set you back about $55 or 35 quid. Reasonable enough for a wrestling game back then, I suppose. Paye. Overall, it sounds like ZY, the reviewer, thinks it's a decent wrestling game if you're into that sort of thing. Not setting the world on fire, but good enough to waste a few hours on with your mates. This page talks about wrestling moves in the game WCW vs NWO World Tour. It's got a feature called All the Right Moves, showcasing some pretty brutal sounding wrestling techniques with names like neck a la carte, knee hee hee, lift, throw and claypole dance and flat back floor, and even one called Guess Who. Each move has a little description, some screenshots of the action in the game, and a bit of commentary. They're all about limb breaking and looking painful, as you'd expect from wrestling. There's a section called Macho Mania, which is all about cheat codes to unlock wrestlers. Remember cheat codes? We loved those back then. It mentions you can play as Diamond Dallas Page, Glacier, Joe Bruiser and Black Widow, Macho Man Randy Savage, and Wrath. You had to jump through hoops in the game to unlock them, like beating certain wrestlers in League Challenge mode, or winning against Wrath. It was all good fun trying to unlock these secret characters. Then there's a review section, broken down into categories. Visuals are described as having nightmarish collision detection, but good, bulky wrestlers, and some lovely animation. Sounds are apparently fine crowd noises and a guitar soundtrack that ought to be outlawed, which sounds like a typical slightly over-the-top comment from back then. Mastery reckons it's Whilst being a good run-out for the N64's polygonal prowess, there's a lack of speed and actual fighting skill. Ouch, bit of a dig there. Lifespan is plenty of options, plenty of grapplers, but ultimately not enough to keep you plodding through. So maybe not the longest lasting game then. Finally, the verdict says, the sort of game we'd imagined it would be, perfectly acceptable in all departments, and even rather entertaining in spells, but never enough to sustain interest and, ultimately, expensive at the asking price. Sounds like a solid, okay then, not amazing but not terrible either. It gets a score of 70%. The review is written by Tim Weaver, which I think ZY used to call Zai, back in the day if I remember correctly. Overall, it's a look at some of the more flashy bits of WCW vs NWO World Tour, and a fairly balanced review that doesn't get too carried away with the hype. Seems like a decent game for a bit of button-bashing fun, but maybe not a classic for the ages. This page is an import arena section from an N64 magazine. Looks like they're having a peek at Famista 64. Right off the bat, you see a big score, 68%, not exactly a glowing recommendation, is it? The verdict box says, has the brains and the looks but somehow soon descends into boredom. Ouch. They are hoping for something bigger from Namco next time. The review itself is titled, Namco? On the N64? Yes, but don't get excited just yet. Bit of a mixed message there then. Apparently there are two reasons to be disappointed. Firstly, it's baseball, which they imply is already a bit dull, and secondly, it's supposedly underachieving on the N64, compared to the likes of Rage Racer, Tekken, Time Crisis or Soul Blade. Strong words, those are all crackers. But the reviewer, Tim Weaver, does say it's not completely awful, more like, good, but not great. There's a little accessibility section with a Union Jack flag saying A and nope, and very very hard but with perseverance, probably just about accessible. Sounds like a challenge then. Looking at the ratings boxes, visuals get a 7, saying, lovely hires players but not dealing with diverse animation. Sounds are a lowly 4, described as, tedious, limited sound effects, and my first keyboard music. Oh dear. Mastery gets a 5 for slick presentation but never threatens to stretch the machine, and Lifespan gets a 6, saying it's probably as good as baseball games are going to get, but you know, it's baseball. Not exactly selling it, are they? There are a few screenshots showing chunky cartoony players, including one mentioning Pac-Man's Castle Stadium, which sounds a bit bonkers. They also mention King of Pro Baseball and Power Pro Baseball as predecessors. The reviewer reckons the AI is intelligent and the game is a serious baseball sim, despite the cartoony look and pudgy performers. He does complain about it being criminally slow and the batsmen only falling into slow reactions or no reactions categories. Overall, it sounds like a bit of a letdown if you were hoping for a killer app, but maybe alright if you're desperate for a baseball fix on the N64 and can put up with its quirks. Not exactly going to be setting the world on fire, is it? This page depicts an import arena review of MK Mythologies, Sub-Zero for the N64, from back in the day, January 1998. It says at the bottom there, issue 11. It's a bit of a blast from the past looking at this now. In it? Right, so they're calling it MK Mythologies, Sub-Zero. Blimey. Sub-Zero getting his own game, who'd have thought? Apparently it's trying to be a mix of Mortal Kombat trilogy, a platform game, and even a bit of RPG thrown in for good measure. Sounds a bit ambitious, doesn't it? You run around as Sub-Zero, beating up chaps and getting experience points to unlock special moves. A good idea? Or not? The review asks, quite rightly. They've got these Sub-Zero facts scattered about. Fact 1 says the animation is just like MK Trilogy, even down to Sub-Zero's crab-like walk. Fact 2 mentions the controls are a bit clunky, using up to jump, which apparently the reviewer thought had been outlawed. Ha, bit harsh, but we were getting used to better controls by 98, weren't we? The screenshots show some typical MK-style action, and some rather ropey-looking platform sections. There's Quan Chi looking like his usual creepy self, and Sub-Zero freezing some poor sod. One caption mentions getting crushed by a pillar again, which doesn't sound too fun. The review is split into visuals, sounds, mastery, and lifespan. Visuals gets a bit of a ribbing, saying the backgrounds are nice, but the action on top is cataract-inducing. Ouch. Sounds are described as feeble oriental music, with some crunches and eggs. Mastery seems to be taking the mickey too, saying you'll barely be able to tell you've switched your N64 on. Lifespan gets a slightly kinder, although it has made us laugh quite a bit. The verdict in big letters says, it's MK Trilogy, but with some platform and RPG bits. Then they slap a 9% score on it. 9%? Good grief, that's a stinker, isn't it? The reviewer, Jonathan Davies, reckons they normally finish games before reviewing them, but they abandoned MK Mythologies, substandard on level 2. He'd rather play Wheel of Fortune or Cruisin' USA. Crikey, that bad, eh? He does admit it's awful, but it makes Wheel of Fortune seem fun. Blimey. Looks like MK Mythologies. Sub-Zero was a bit of a duffer then, even back in '98. Probably best forgotten, eh? Still, makes you chuckle looking back at these old reviews. 9%, eh? Poor show. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 11 it looks like, is a bit of a look ahead to 1998, calling it a spa, whatever that means. Probably something to do with relaxing into the new year, I don't know, bit pretentious if you ask me. Anyway, at the top left you've got that Space World 97 logo, remember that? Seemed ages ago. By January 1998, Space World 97 was all the way back in November 97. It was always a bit of a tease, that, wasn't it? Showing off all the cool stuff from Japan, months before we'd maybe get a sniff of it over here. The main picture shows a busy game show floor with loads of Game Boy units. Seems like a blast from the past now, everyone huddled around those tiny screens. Down below they've got a little section for games and it's Yoshi's Story, bless it. Looks alright I suppose. Very colourful and all that, but hardly pushing the N64 to its limits, is it? Then there's 64D AD, which is always just around the corner, isn't it? They've got a Pokemon Stadium 2 screenshot. Pokemon that was still properly massive at this point, wasn't it? Everyone was still obsessed. Finally, there's a picture of Miyamoto himself under Miyamoto. He's holding up the very magazine we're looking at. Bit meta that. Looks like the cover story is about LYLAT Wars, which we know as Star Fox 64, cracking game that was, even if ZY over there probably gave it a 95% and called it groundbreaking like they always did. Still, good times. This page is from an old N64 magazine, must be around January 1998, and it's all about Nintendo Space World 97. It's a feature piece called Odyssey, seems to be their take on the whole event. Basically, Nintendo let the Tokyo public get a sneak peek at what they had cooking for the future, and this is N64 Mag's report on what they saw. Apparently, nearly 250,000 people showed up to Space World 97 in Tokyo. Blimey, that's a lot. They were showcasing all the upcoming games we'd be itching to play on our N64s in '98. You can see a photo of the crowds, looks absolutely rammed, and there's a picture of the official Space World 97 guidebook, got Link from Zelda on the cover, Yoshi, and even some Pokemon on there. Blast from the past, eh? And a huge Chansey statue, what a sight. The N64 magazine crew were there soaking it all in, lucky devils, and they even managed to bump into Shigeru Miyamoto himself, Mario's dad as they say with a bit of a smirk. They got to play the new games, and this article is about their first impressions. Sounds like there was a mix of good news, surprises, and a bit of disappointment, as usual with these things, but overall they seem pretty hyped for what's on the horizon for the N64. It's their impressions of the games, and the whole show. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 11, takes us back to Nintendo Space World 97, which was quite a big deal at the time as it was in Japan and we didn't get to go. It looks like it was rammed with people. Judging by the photos, 250,000 eager punters apparently. They even had to introduce a timed badge system to manage the queues, can you imagine? The show hall was massive, split into zones. The left side was all about the new N64 games, naturally. The middle was showcasing the 64DD and the Game Boy camera, remember those? Bit of a mixed bag those were, some promise but didn't quite set the world on fire. And then the right side was dedicated to Game Boy and Pocket Monsters, or Pokemon, as we all know it now. Seems like Pokemon was already massive back then as they dedicated loads of space to it. Apparently, there was a special download for some 51st Pocket Monster, and it was so popular, they had to do a lottery, just for the chance to download it. Bonkers really, but shows how crazy people were for Pokemon even back then. Down at the bottom there's a section called the N64 Eager Waitometer. It's rating the N64 games at the show, based on how good they looked and played, and how much they were anticipating them. A bit of hype building before Christmas, standard magazine fare really, but we lapped it up back then, didn't we? Good times, even if we were just reading about it over here in Blighty. This page is all about games for the N64 back in January 1998. Looks like they're reviewing a few bits and bobs, kicking off with Yoshi's Story. Seems there was a bit of a kerfuffle, as eager fans turned up at Space World expecting to play it, only to find out it was delayed. Typical Nintendo, always keeping you waiting. Anyway, the reviewer, James, actually quite liked it, even though he's apparently platformer-phobic. He reckons even the grumpiest gamer would crack a smile playing it, which is high praise indeed. It's a 2D platformer, which was a bit old school even then when everyone was raving about 3D, but it sounds like it's got its charm. You pick your Yoshi at the start, and apparently, they all have different tastes in fruit, fancy that. Gameplay-wise, you're picking up fruit, avoiding enemies, and chucking eggs about. Sounds pretty standard Yoshi fare. They mention a storybook theme, with pop-up book level selects, which sounds quite sweet actually. They say it's not too difficult, maybe a bit on the easy side if Yoshi's life meter is anything to go by, but charming enough. Then there's a quick look at NBA in the Zone from Konami. Apparently it was overshadowed by Nintendo's own basketball game, maybe NBA Courtside, but still worth a look. It was due out in Japan in January '98. Sounds competent enough, but nothing to really set it apart from other basketball games at the time, especially on the PlayStation. They reckon it lacks control compared to Nintendo's offering. Ouch. Worryings at the time. Next up is Brave Spirits, a wrestling game from Hudson Soft. They say it's the N64's first wrestling game, which is interesting. Rave fans, whoever they are apparently going to be pleased. They're not sure how pleased they'll remain after actually playing it though. A bit of skepticism there. The N64 testers were apparently a bit confused by the controls, and they'll give it a proper review next month. Sounds like a bit of a mixed bag then. Finally, there's World Championship Wrestling from Asmic, out now apparently. They think it's actually WCW versus NWO in Japanese disguise. They'll review it next month to see what it's really like. Sounds a bit generic to be honest, there were loads of wrestling games around then. For each game they've got one of those eager waitometer things, which is basically a bar chart showing how excited they are. Or aren't, I suppose. Yoshi's story is looking pretty full, NBA in the Zone, and Brave Spirits are a bit less enthusiastic, and World Championship Wrestling is barely registering. Sums it up really. This page is about the upcoming Pikachu Genki Dechu game for the N64, you know, the one where Pikachu talks back to you. It's being developed by Nintendo, and at the time it was still a bit mysterious release, and price-wise, all TBA and unknown. Apparently this game is all about building a relationship with Pikachu, a proper interactive, communicative, nurturing experience, according to Nintendo's big boss Mr. Yamauchi. They're even saying it's not really a game in the traditional sense, more about looking after the little electric fella. To make this happen, you need a new add-on, a voice recognition unit. The idea is you chat to Pikachu through a headset, a bit like having a Tamagotchi, but on your telly and with a microphone. The article says Pikachu starts off a bit nervous and mistrustful. I suppose that's fair enough if some strange human starts talking at you through a headset. You're supposed to show him you're alright, and gain his trust. Bit weird really, like some kind of virtual pet therapy. They've got these pictures showing Pikachu's different moods, bright, unsure, laughing, sad/sorry, all very emotional for a computer game critter. There's even one called eating, equiv to bon appetit, and flattered, lapping up the attention. Honestly, a bit much, isn't it? There are a couple of funny comments from whoever ZY is. One about giant real-life Pikachu being scary at Space World. That must have been something to see. And another one about the computer Pikachu talking back being weird. Spot on ZY. Bit odd indeed. Norsa Hasmi. It mentions Tamagotchi and Pocket Monsters being massive, and reckons this Pikachu game will be just as big with the young'uns in Japan, what with the whole pet thing still being trendy. And they admit, Pikachu's pretty cute, can't argue with that. Wainchenstall. Down the bottom there's the N64, eager waitometer. Almost maxed out, guess everyone was well up for more N64 games back then. Good times. This page from the magazine takes a look at a few games that were either just out or on the horizon for the N64 back in January 1998. First up is Holy Magic Century L-Tale, which is being developed by Imagineer. Apparently they'd played it back in June, and it was still only 60% complete by this point, which raised an eyebrow or two. It's slated for a March release, priced at 6,980 yen. The reviewer, Zai, mentions the first level looks nice and packed with characters, and Konami were picking up the European distribution. Sounds like they were cautiously optimistic, hoping it'd be a decent RPG when it finally arrived. Then there's Aero Gauge from ASC2, already finished and due out in December, at 7,800 yen. Now this one doesn't sound too promising. Zai calls it a Wipeout clone, and not in a good way. Apparently it's difficult because you can't see where you're going on the track half the time. Only 5 vehicles and 4 courses, and the programming sounds a bit dodgy, with suggestions of borrowing ideas from Psygnosis. Safe to say Zai wasn't exactly buzzing for this one. Warrington. Next on the list is Rev Limit from Sata, with a May release planned and also 60% complete, priced at 6,980 yen. Oh dear, this sounds like a right mess. Zai reckons Senator weren't pushing it at the show because it wasn't up to scratch. Loads of vehicles apparently, more than 13, but that's about the only good thing. They had issues with the game being absent, broken, or just plain dodgy. Only a couple of courses, ropey graphics, and the car handling was apparently terrible, leading Zai to wonder if the developers had ever even been in a car. Not a glowing review then, Jete. Finally, there's a smaller mention of Denryu Irabuno by Hudson Soft. This one's already out, priced at 5,980 yen. It's described as a frustrating electric stick game that was drawing crowds, likely because it was tied into a Japanese TV show. The idea is to move a ball around an electrified course without touching the sides. Sounds like it was mainly for the Japanese market, and Zai didn't seem too bothered about it not coming out here, to be honest. Across the page they've got these N64 Megaweightometer things for each game, basically little bar charts showing how hyped they were for each title. Holy Magic Century gets a bit of red, showing some anticipation, but the others, Arrow Gouge, Reverend Limit and Denryu Irabu, are practically empty, which pretty much sums up their feelings about those games at the time. Bit of a mixed bag then, but that was often the way back then, wasn't it? You never quite knew what you were gonna get. This page is about a preview of the NBA basketball game that Nintendo was doing for the N64 back in the day. Bit of a surprise really, Nintendo doing a basketball game wasn't really their thing, was it? Turns out it's being made by Left Field Productions according to the credits, and it's Nintendo of America behind it. It's still early days, only half done apparently, but the reviewer ZY reckons you can already see that typical Nintendo polish. It's going for a proper 10-player simulation, not like that daft 4-player hangtime game. Apparently they're using the C buttons for special moves, described as a confusing swivel, and a cunning behind-the-back turn and dodge. Sounds a bit complicated for me, mind. Controls are kept fairly simple otherwise, A button for pass or shoot, B to steal, and you can use the Z trigger with jump/block for dunks. One thing they liked was the R button, lets you move your player with their back to the basket, shielding the ball, making you look like a bandy-legged crab apparently. There's even a stamina meter for trick shots. Graphically it's looking crisp and sharp, even though they haven't finished all the fancy bits like player reflections and shadows yet. They reckon it's already better than Konami's attempt at an NBA game. The reviewer thought it felt a bit slow in this early version, and hopes they'll speed it up a bit before release. Overall they seemed quite pleased with it, saying Nintendo's giving the basketball game genre a good kick up the ass. We'll have to wait until July for the full release though. And they had a laugh about the basket having a reflection but the players not, calling it odd, eh? There are a few screenshots showing the game in action, with teams Los Angeles and Chicago playing. One screenshot mentions Pippen dunking, and the reviewer jokes about, is there no stopping him? Looks alright for the time, I suppose. And at the bottom, there's the N64 Megaweightometer, which is nearly full, so people were obviously quite excited about it back then. This page depicts a spread from an N64 magazine. Looks like they're previewing a few upcoming games. Noi? First up, we've got SimCity 2000. Remember SimCity on the SNES? Yeah, good times. Apparently, Imagineer are doing an N64 version, due out in December 97, though it was 90% complete at the time of writing. They reckon it'll be about £68. The reviewer, someone called ZY, doesn't sound too impressed compared to Nintendo's 64DD version, saying it's a bit drab and isometric, especially compared to swooping through your cities in 3D. Still, they mention the point-and-click is still there, and you can build massive urban sprawls. They're wondering if Imagineer can make it interesting again, especially with the 64DD delays, meaning they've got less competition now. There's a couple of screenshots showing the isometric view, and some anime-style characters, not sure what they're about in SimCity. Woof! Then there's BioTetris from bottom up, March release, 90% complete, and £78. This one sounds a bit odd. Apparently, it comes with a special memory pack that clips to your ear to read your pulse. Seems like the game adjusts itself depending on your heart rate, making it easier if you get stressed. Bit of a weird gimmick in it. The reviewer seems a bit dubious, suggesting there might be better uses for that tech. There's a picture of the memory pack, and someone looking a bit daft with it, clipped to their ear. Next, Fighting Cup from Imagineer, April release, 95% complete, £68. This one's already out in Europe apparently, but Imagineer are doing a Japanese version. Something about Ocean still hoping for a pre-Christmas release? Bit confusing. Anyway, it's a football game, looks like. Bidarincha. Then there's Kirato Kaigetsu, also Imagineer, March release, 60% complete, and £6,980. Hold on, that's probably 6,980 yen. A bit cheaper in pounds then. This sounds really strange, like a board game with real-life animated figures. Each square you land on has something different hidden. They couldn't make head nor tail of it, but reckon it might be a surprise hit for 98. Screenshot shows some sort of figure on a colorful board. Lastly, Morita Shogi from Sata, April release, 100% complete, and 9,800 yen. Shogi is Japanese chess, right? This is endorsed by some Shogi Grandmaster, Mr. Morita. Sounds like a very straightforward simulator, nothing too fancy. They've got a copy reserved, so they'll be reviewing it later. Nukork. Overall, a bit of a mixed bag of games coming up. SimCity 2000 sounds a bit dated already, Bio Tetris is just plain weird, and the other two Japanese games are a bit of a mystery. Fighting Cup is probably just another footy game. Not sure if any of these are going to be must-haves, to be honest. This page depicts a couple of game previews from what must be an old issue of N64 Magazine. I reckon it's probably early 98, going by the Space World 97 logo at the top there. First up is Dual Heroes from Hudson Soft. Blimey, out now Japan, and 100% status. They were quick off the mark, weren't they? Price is 6,980 yen, which is probably a bit steep. Apparently, it was one of the better beat-em-ups at Space World. They call it heavily anime-influenced, and mention robot things, and pert-bottomed anime babes. Typical lads mag stuff really. Controls are like Virtua Fighter, block, punch, kick, simple enough. The reviewer, ZY I suppose, seems a bit worried about input lag. Which is fair enough for a fighting game, isn't it? They were skeptical about the whole thing, mind, but said they'd wait and see. Below that is Hiryu no Ken Twin from Culture Brain. Also, out now Japan, and 100% done and dusted. Same price as Dual Heroes. This one's Art of Fighting Twin in Japan. The gimmick here is two completely different art styles. You've got the realistic tall fighters like Dual Heroes and Virtua Fighter, and then the super deformed cute types like Snowbo Kids or King of Pro Baseball. Odd mix if you ask me. Apparently you can't mix and match styles between players, which is a bit of a shame. Fighting styles are Kung Fu, Karate, Wrestling, the usual, with throws, kicks, punches, projectiles the lot. Culture Brain were hoping for an American release in April, but no word on the UK. ZY reckons if they pull off the sprite to polygon thing successfully, it could be a hit. They're keeping an eye on it apparently. Both games have a N64 Ega weightometer, which are mostly red, so I guess they were somewhat anticipated back then. Goodness knows if either of them were any good in the end though. Can't rightly remember. This page depicts a spread from an old N64 magazine. Looks like we are in January 98. Right then, let's have a gander at what we've got. First up is GASP, Fighters NEXTREME from Konami. Sounds a bit shouty, doesn't it? Apparently it's getting there, slowly but surely, this beat 'em up. They showed a wobbly version at some show called ECTS, and now it's a bit more presentable at Space World. They reckon the graphics are sharper and faster, bit like Virtua Fighter but not quite Soul Blade standard yet. They still need to put some elbow grease in if it's going to be a proper N64 brawler, mind you. Price is 7,800 yen, due in March, and about 80% done. They've got some folks in the office bashing away at it. Apparently two had to go to matron. Sounds intense. Next we have King of Pro Baseball 2. Imagineer behind this one, coming out in January, also 80% complete, and costing 6,980 yen. Seems the Japanese gaming lot didn't quite agree with our reviewers on the first one, calling it a midget baseball sim. Bit harsh maybe? Anyway, they thought the first King of Pro was alright. This one's got bat indicators and mini replays, fancy that. Resolution's a bit dodgy apparently, and camera angles are taking some getting used to. Since the first one never left Japan, we probably won't see this one either, so maybe no worries then. Warrington used to. Then we have SNOW Kids from Atlas. This one's already out. Fully done, 6,800 yen. Sounds like they played this after a few other snow games. 1080 Degrees, Nagano, Snow Speeder. Might be a bit rubbish then if they were already bored of snow games. They only had a quick go before security chucked them out of Space World. Stunt course and downhill track, yeah, sounds standard. Apparently the characters are a bit super deformed big head variety, which makes accurate movement a right pain. Full review next issue, they solemnly promise. Roke. Lastly, there's Super Robot Spirits from Banpresto. March release, 50% done. Price TBA. For the mech fans apparently. Chocolate mint on your pillow. What are they on about? Seems it's a straight up mech punch up. Not much tactical running and hiding. Graphics are a bit low res, and the mechs are a bit samey. They reckon it's rudimentary. Bit of a confusion over the release date though. Sounds like Mr. Slip needs to sort that out at Banpresto HQ. Which one am I, they ask. Cryptic. Oh well, another month, another magazine, eh? This page depicts a preview of two games from Nintendo Space World, 97, Snow Speeder and Jungle Emperor Leo. Starting at the top, There's Snowspeeder from Imagineer. Apparently they reckoned it was 70% complete and due out in March for 6,980 yen, which sounds like a fair whack of cash. But, according to ZY, the reviewer, that 70% claim was a bit of a fib, more like 50% perhaps. They reckon it's a mixed bag visually with some dodgy bits, especially compared to 1080 degrees. Snowboarding, which was already setting the bar pretty high for snow sports games on the N64. The controls are simple enough, break and jump / stunts, and you steer with the stick. Standard stuff really. Split-screen multiplayer is mentioned, which is always a good shout for a bit of competitive fun with mates. Graphically, it sounds a bit rough, polygons glitching and disappearing not ideal. The reviewer is sitting on the fence with this one. It's got potential but needs a lot of polish. The eager weightometer for Snowspeeder is showing about half full, suggesting a cautious optimism. Below that is Jungle Emperor Leo, from Nintendo themselves, so potentially a bigger deal. Release and price are TBA, so still early days. This one's apparently Miyamoto's next big thing, based on a cartoon series that's a hit in Japan but maybe not so much over here. It's likened to Disney's The Lion King, and there's even talk of legal issues, which sounds intriguing. They only saw a video at Space World, not a playable game, but they think it could be a big hit, maybe even worth waiting until 1999 for. Though, they do have a bit of a giggle at the lion looking a bit more like a friendly pussycat than a fearsome jungle king. The eager weightometer for Jungle Emperor Leo is almost full, so there's definitely more excitement for this one, even if it's a bit of an unknown quantity at this stage. This page from a gaming mag, must be early 98 given the titles, is having a look at some of the latest N64 games. First up, it's Nagano Winter Olympics from Konami. Seems like your typical winter sports compilation, but they reckon it's a bit faster paced than usual and a bit easier on the eyes. They mention downhill and slalom skiing are decent, and there's a funny comment about the bobsled being a bit hit and miss once you get going. Looks alright, nothing groundbreaking though. Roo? Then there's Tamagotchi World 64, which is a bit of a weird one. Tamagotchis were massive, weren't they? This one's by Bandai, and apparently it's utterly incomprehensible, something about collecting and swapping. Graphics aren't up to much it seems, even for the time, but they reckon it could be important for Nintendo's 64DD plans. Strange. Next up, Augusta Masters 98, a golf game from T&E Soft. They're saying it's a big improvement over previous golf games, proper digitized swings and all that. Apparently it's closer to what you'd see on a PC, which was always the benchmark back then for graphics. Sounds like a solid golf sim for the N64. Finally, there's Pachinko 365 Days from Seta. Pachinko, Japanese gambling machines, massively popular over there, a bit baffling to us Brits really. This is a virtual version, and apparently, Nintendo are releasing it over here with a big TV campaign. Only joking, it says. Right then, Jasser. Down the bottom there's a bit about games that are showing up and sneaking off. Showing up are games new to Japan but not over here yet. It lists things like NFL Quarterback Club 98, Extreme G, Clay Fighter, Wayne Gretzky 98, San Francisco Rush, Hexen, Top Gear Rally, Lamborghini 64, and FIFA 98. Sneaking off are surprising absentees, games they were expecting but didn't see, including Conker's Quest, Mother 3, other 64DD bits and bobs, Body Harvest, and anything from Namco or Capcom like Hybrid Heaven and Castlevania. So a bit of a wish list, and what's coming over from Japan. Throughout the page they've got these N64 eager weightometer things which are like hype meters for each game, just little bars filled in red. Seems like Nagano and Augusta Masters are getting a decent amount of hype, Tamagotchi and Pachinko less so. Pretty standard games page for the time, a bit of everything. This page from N64 Magazine is all about the 64DD, Nintendo's disk drive add-on for the N64, which we in the UK were still waiting to get our hands on. It's from Space World 97, and they've had a peek at it, although just behind glass it sounds like. Typical. The article reckons Nintendo is really banking on this 64DD thing, especially in Japan. They're showing off Pocket Monsters Stadium, which looks like a monster battling game, with those little Pokemon fellas from the Game Boy. You can see a screenshot, with what looks like a Charizard and Blastoise battling it out. Proper monster mashup. Apparently Nintendo is trying to tempt the Pocket Monsters crowd onto the N64 and the 64DD, as the article mentions that traditional Nintendo games aren't doing as well in Japan anymore, even titles like Star Fox 64 and GoldenEye 007. Seems a bit harsh. Star Fox 64 was alright. GoldenEye, well that was something else, wasn't it? The reviewer, a chap called Zai, reckons the 64D Walgadi hardware is a big step up, but the software is a bit weird. Not exactly a glowing endorsement, is it? Still, they do say Pocket Monsters is a massive game in Japan. even bigger than Super Mario Bros., so maybe Nintendo are onto something with this disc drive and monster craze. They mention a special controller for Pocket Monsters Stadium too. Sounds like they are throwing everything at this Pokemon thing. We'll have to see if it actually takes off when it finally comes out over here, if it ever does. This page is all about the 64DD, Nintendo's wacky new add-on for the N64. Right then, what's the deal with this thing? Apparently it sits underneath your console and uses these special discs that are supposed to be massive, like 8 times bigger than a Mario 64 cart, which is a decent chunk of data back then. They're even writable, which is a bit different. Warrington Gulkar. They're banging on about how these discs are faster than CDs, meaning less waiting around for games to load, thank goodness. And it's got a clock built in, like a PC, for games to keep track of time even when you switch off. Which sounds a bit fancy for the time, may be useful for those role-playing games if you're into that sort of thing. There was talk of a modem too, for getting online, but apparently that's gone out the window for now. Shame really, that internet thing was starting to get a bit of buzz. Maybe later they reckon. Worry. No price yet, cheeky buggers, but they're saying it should be cheap, maybe even less than the N64 itself. We'll see about that, won't we? Release date's been pushed back to June in Japan and Europe. Don't hold your breath before next year, mate. As for what you'll actually play on it, well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. They're showing off this Maker Trilogy Talent Maker, Picture Maker, Polygon Maker. Sounds a bit like Mario Paint on steroids if you ask me. All about being creative and that. They mention you could even design your own tower blocks and live in them. Sort of, they say. Whatever that means. Looks like you can swap your pictures between these Maker programs, and even chuck your drawings into Talent Maker. Which sounds a bit pointless, doesn't it? Oh, and you can apparently build cities in SimCity 64, and fly around in SimCopter. Now that's more like it, SimCity on the N64. Could be alright. Then there's talk about a special video thingy, the N64 capture cassette and camcorder. You can plug it in and map your face onto some 3D bloke in a game. Bonkers, isn't it? There's a screenshot of some right ugly mug, could be anyone's face really. Border. They're also banging on about Pocket Monsters Snap and Pikachu Genki Dechu, those Japanese games, using the 64's 3D power. And apparently there's a 64DD version of Zelda coming, though maybe not as amazing as we were hoping. Oh, and they're doing an F-Zero X version where you can design your own tracks and use extra music. 1080 snowboarding gets a mention too. Though maybe not. ZY, the reviewer, reckons Nintendo thinks they're proper visionaries, and that the future is all about creativity software. Bit much if you ask me. He's not totally sold on these ideas either. Wants proper games, not just another Mario Paint. But he admits Nintendo aren't completely forgetting about proper games either, thank goodness. Miyamoto's still involved, so hopefully it won't be all daft creative stuff and there'll be some decent games that use the 64DD's extra grunt. We'll have to wait and see, won't we? This page is all about the 64DD add-on for the N64, remember that? It was supposed to be the future of N64. Bigger games, more storage, all that jazz. Looking back, it's quite funny really, didn't exactly set the world on fire, did it? Anyway, this article is titled 64DD Softs, and it's previewing some of the launch titles. First up is Talent Maker, which sounds absolutely bonkers. Apparently you can create your own pop star. It's got screenshots showing some strange-looking character on stage, doing what I can only assume is singing and dancing. They mention you can stretch arms and legs, choose clothes, and even record your own singing for a karaoke effect. Sounds a bit like a fever dream to be honest, but I suppose back then, we were intrigued by anything a bit different. Then there's Picture Maker, which they say is like Mario Paint on the N64. So it's an art package, letting you draw and animate. The screenshot shows some very colourful and abstract artwork, a bit like what you'd get if you let a kid loose with crayons. Apparently you could use multiple brushes at once for multiplayer doodling, which fair enough, could be a laugh. They reckon it'll be good for creating images for other 64DD games, like Polygon Maker and SimCity 64. Speaking of which, Pocket Monsters Stadium gets a mention. This is the one that might actually tempt a few people to buy a 64DD, I reckon. It's all about bringing your Pokemon from the Game Boy to the big screen in 3D. The screenshots do look quite good for the time, showing Pokemon battling in proper 3D arenas. They say the graphics are great and you can zoom right in on the monsters, which is probably true compared to the blurry sprites on the Game Boy. The reviewer reckons it's only for PM fans, which is fair enough, and they don't think there are many of those outside Japan. A bit harsh maybe, Pokemon was pretty popular even back then, wasn't it? Woo! Finally there's SimCity 64. Now this actually looks quite promising. It's SimCity, but in 3D. The screenshots show cities from different angles, isometric and street level, with cars and people wandering about. They say you can zoom right down to street level, and see people walking around, which is pretty impressive for the N64. The reviewer thinks it's going to be the best version of SimCity yet. We'll see about that, haven't we heard that before? Overall, the 64DD softs look a bit of a mixed bag, don't they? Talent Maker sounds completely off the wall. Picture Maker is alright if you're into that sort of thing. Pocket Monsters Stadium could be a system seller for some, and SimCity 64 inches is the one with real potential. Whether any of it is enough to make the 64DD a success is another question entirely. They're all due in Japan in July, and it's anyone's guess if we'll ever see them over here in Europe. Probably not, knowing Nintendo's track record with these things. This page depicts some exciting new gadgets for the 64DD, under the banner of Portable Print Club. First up there's Polygon Maker, which they reckon is for budding Jurassic Park dinosaur creators. It sounds like a 3D modeling tool, making it easier to create 3D objects, even on the humble N64, which back then, even with powerful hardware, was supposed to be a laborious process. They've even got a picture of a polygonal T-Rex made with it. Next is Pocket Monsters Snap, or Pokemon Snap as we'd probably call it now. ZY, the reviewer, seems quite taken with the idea of roaming around taking photos of pocket monsters, storing them in an album thanks to the 64DD's writable discs. They're calling it weird and yet at the same time brilliant, which sounds about right for Nintendo at the time, always coming up with bonkers ideas. They seem quite keen, saying, but hey, it could be really good fun, we're looking forward to it. Bit enthusiastic, aren't they, ZY? Then there's SimCopter 64, which they admit was a bit dull on the PC, but reckon the 64DD version will be better. It's all about flying around cities you've built in SimCity, apparently with improved graphics. And F0DD is mentioned, where you can construct your own courses and cars, which sounds pretty decent for the time. Crux. There's also talk of Cabbage, which sounds a bit odd. It's described as a highly sophisticated version of Tamagotchi, where you create a character that lives inside your 64DD machine, even when it's switched off. Miyamoto apparently suggests you might be able to download your character onto a Game Boy cart and take it about with you. Bit strange, that one. Or, lastly, they're on about the Pocket Camera and Pocket Printer. The Pocket Camera, they say, looks like a Game Boy cart with a camera sticking out. You can take pictures, and even draw borders and scribble on them. A bit like a Lofi digital camera for your Game Boy. They even suggest you can exchange pictures with mates using a data link cable, which is very forward-thinking for 98. It's priced at 5,500 yen, about £25, and they're getting one sent over from Japan in February. The Pocket Printer, naturally, prints out your pocket camera creations using thermal paper, like a till receipt printer, and costs another 5,800 yen. They even make a slightly sarcastic reference to the ZX printer, saying, remember the ZX printer? This works with your Game Boy and doesn't use silver paper. Ha! That's a good point. Sounds like Nintendo were really pushing the boat out with these 64DD peripherals. They finish off by mentioning there are about 30 N64 games in development, many disc-based, and hinting about the second Zelda game being on disc but not definite yet. Typical Nintendo, always teasing. This page has a bit of a chinwag with the big cheeses at Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi and Shigeru Miyamoto, you know, the ones who really pull the strings. Apparently these two are the fellas looking into the crystal ball and deciding where Nintendo, and frankly gaming in general, is headed. One's a money man, and the other one's all about Mario. Classic combo, eh? Geyo. It seems they were both at Space World, which was a big deal back then if you were into Nintendo, and Yamauchi gave a speech, probably to a load of journos and excited fans. He reckons the N64 was doing alright in America, but sales had slowed a bit here and in Japan. He blames it on a lack of games, which was a common moan at the time, to be fair. He also goes on about folks getting bored with the same old game types, and not many companies bothering to come up with fresh ideas. Bit rich coming from Nintendo sometimes, but he's got a point, everyone was chasing the same pound notes. He mentions Pocket Monsters over in Japan being massive, that's Pokemon to us now. And yeah, that did explode, didn't it? Prelude. Then there's Miyamoto, looking as cheerful as ever, sporting an N64 badge, bless him. He's talking about how they've been analyzing games, and they reckon they've found 4 key ideas that will shape the future. A bit dramatic, but that's Miyamoto for you. One of these big ideas is nurturing games, like Tamagotchi. Remember those little digital pets? Apparently Nintendo were trying something similar on the 64DD called Cabbage. Never really heard of that one taking off though, did it? Still, they were clearly thinking about new types of games, beyond just jumping on turtles, which is fair enough. So yeah, Yamauchi and Miyamoto, the two blokes steering the Nintendo ship, giving their thoughts on where it's all going. Quite insightful stuff for 98 really. This page shows a glimpse into the talk from Nintendo Space World 97. It's a page from N64 Magazine back in January 1998. There's a big picture of Hiroshi Yamauchi looking a bit stern, and apparently, according to the little text blurb, he went on for ages at Spaceworld, but the real message was just, buy Pocket Monsters. Always with the sales pitch, eh? Be key. Then there are a few bits about what Nintendo was showing off. First up, there's a Pokemon Stadium screenshot, with a Charizard and Blastoise battling it out, asking what role it'll play in Nintendo's future. Well, we all know how massive Pokemon became, don't we? Probably a bit of a no-brainer in hindsight. Next, there are a couple of bits about the Mario artist stuff. One screenshot shows a smiley face picture done in Paint Studio, asking if making pictures could be the future for Nintendo fans worldwide. Bit of a stretch maybe? Digital finger painting wasn't exactly the N64's killer app. Then there's another one with a character wearing a smiley face t-shirt from Talent Studio, wondering if we'd be able to make our own personal games with our own graphics. That sounds a bit ambitious, even for back then, but the idea of custom characters was always appealing. Finally, there's a shot of Glover, and it's asking if we might see characters we design in leading roles. Glover, bless it, was alright, but hardly a system seller, so maybe not every character design would be a winner. Borinton also has Mei Muzel. It's all very forward-looking, thinking about the future of Nintendo and games, which is what you'd expect from a magazine looking back at Spaceworld. Bit of a time capsule, really. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 11 it looks like, is doing a bit of a write-up from Spaceworld 97, back in November. Right at the top there's a big logo, live from Spaceworld 97, with the N64 logo next to it. It seems to be a report from the event in Japan. There's talk about Nintendo believing some things are just impossible on other consoles, other than the N64 and the 64DD, which sounds like typical Nintendo bravado. Then there's a section called Trading and Collecting, which is clearly about Pokemon, or Pocket Monsters as they call it here. They're banging on about the Game Boy Link cable and swapping monsters, saying it's like trading cards back in the day, which is fair enough, that was a big thing with Pokemon. Gear. Next up is Edition, which is interesting, it's about downloadable content basically, even back then they were thinking about it. They mention extra bits and pieces for games released later, and they use F-Zero as an example, saying you could get extra tracks for the 64DD after the game's been out. They reckon it's good for manufacturers, because it keeps sales going, and good for gamers, because you get more out of your game. They're suggesting Miyamoto might release extra tracks for F-Zero on a disc, with a track editor even, which sounds pretty ambitious for the time. Then there are bits with Yamauchi's name on them. Yamauchi on the 64DD launch, he's saying they've delayed it until June to make sure the software lineup is right and to persuade people it's got unique features. He's acknowledging complaints about lack of RPGs, but thinks even RPGs have a limited shelf life, and they want to make games that last longer. Bit rich coming from Nintendo maybe, given the number of sequels they churn out. Yamauchi on Pocket Monsters is about Pokemon again. Nintendo wants everyone to play it, but different countries have different tastes, and they are working on alternative versions. The USA is supposed to be the first country outside Japan to get it, so it was still a bit of a novelty over here in the UK at this point. Jataya. Yamauchi on the future. He's saying the games market is in decline in Japan and will be elsewhere soon if they don't break away from conventional ideas. They want to create a new entertainment industry based on new types of games and related stuff. Sounds a bit dramatic, but I suppose they always talk like that at these events. Waro. There's an N64 comment section where they talk about Yamauchi's speech being a big deal. ZY, the reviewer, reckons Yamauchi is saying we should stop looking at release lists and just focus on the games Nintendo are making, because they want their new games, especially on the 64DD, to be about getting gamers more involved, swapping data and buying extra bits. He uses F-Zero and Pocket Monsters as examples again, suggesting you could get polygon shapes and textures from Picture Maker and Talent Maker to decorate your tracks, and even create your own dungeon levels for Zelda. Bit of a stretch maybe, but the idea of user-generated content was definitely starting to bubble up. Down at the bottom there's a little box, looks like ZY is commenting on Lilac Wars, which we know as Star Fox 64 over here. He seems to be pleased with it, saying he's glad to be responsible for the review, and says if you read it, you'll get it every month. Bit of a cheeky plug for the mag at the end there, and there's a picture of Miyamoto holding up an N64 magazine, presumably this very issue, with Lilac Wars on the cover, so they're definitely pushing that game. This page is all about the thoughts of Shigeru Miyamoto. The big cheese from Nintendo himself seems like he was chatting at Spaceworld 97. He's talking about the future of games, specifically for the N64, and that weird 64DD add-on. Apparently they didn't go for CD-ROM because of non-writable formats, which is fair enough I suppose. Miyamoto's going on about nurturing games like Tamagotchi, and how these are similar to RPGs. He mentions SimCity 64 and SimCopter coming to the 64DD, which sounds interesting, flying helicopters around your SimCity. He's also talking about an F-Zero disc for the 64DD where you can make your own tracks, and a Game Boy adapter for the N64, which could be a bit of alright. Tory. There's a bit about Nintendo wanting to get into exchanging game data in real stores, and how he's worried new generations aren't as interested in computer games anymore, which is a bit doom and gloom, innit? He wants to make games that are loved by everyone, bless him, Dory. And look at this, there's a competition to win Shigeru's autograph. Blimey, on a Space World ticket no less. The question is, what was his first game for Nintendo? Gotta have a think about that one for a mo. Aliwire. Down the side there's the usual import shop advert from Project K, flogging all sorts of bits for the N64, Saturn and PlayStation. Looks like you could get your Japanese white Saturn, RAM cartridges, and recoil light guns. Games-wise they've got Marvel Superheroes, X-Men vs Street Fighter, Last Bronx, Panzer Dragoon Saga, Sonic R for Saturn, and Final Fantasy V-2, Dead or Alive, Dragon Ball GT, Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil 2, and Tekken 3 on PlayStation. Plus some anime, and music CDs like Secret of Mana and My Neighbor Totoro, if you're into that sort of thing. Standard import fare really, always a bit pricey but tempting if you were desperate for something you couldn't get down at Electronics Boutique. This page is an article from N64 Magazine, giving you the lowdown on how to get yourself to a Japanese game show, specifically Space World 97 in Tokyo. It's written by a chap called James Ashton who's been there and done that, fair play to him. So if you fancied yourself a bit of a games journalist back in '97, this article tells you about getting there. They talk about flights, you know, the usual stuff. Virgin Atlantic direct if you're flush, about 800 quid and 12.5 hours. Or if you're a bit strapped for cash, like most of us probably were back then, Singapore Airlines via Amsterdam and Singapore for 580 quid. But blimey, that's 18 hours. And if you're feeling properly mental, Aeroflot via Moscow for 200 quid and a pair of Levi's. That sounds a bit dodgy, mind, and they reckon it takes 2 days. Madness. There are flight tips too, like upgrading to first class if you've got loads of dosh, but mostly common sense stuff like not being a prat on the plane. There's a funny bit about Airplane Loose and how loud they are, warning you not to press the flush button and freak out the Japanese businessmen. There's a photo of the game show floor, packed with punters all trying to get a go on the N64s. Looked like a right scrum. It's all about getting that scoop live from Tokyo, and this article's supposed to be a comprehensive guide to doing just that, or at least reporting fairly anyway. Good on James for sharing his wisdom, might have been useful if you were actually planning to go. Probably a bit late for Space World 97 now though, seeing as it's January 98. Still, good info for the next one maybe. This page from an old N64 mag, it's from the diary section, which is a bit of a travelogue it seems, detailing someone's trip to Japan. It starts with arrival and surviving jet lag, pointing out how Japan is ahead of us time-wise, which was always a head-scratcher when you were younger, wasn't it? It mentions the Japanese sense of humor at immigration, and the jet lag tips suggest staying awake and watching Japanese telly, though what that was like back then, probably bonkers game shows and samurai dramas as it mentions later on. There's even a bit about useful phrases for the jet-lagged, for when you are feeling ropey. Then it moves on to making yourself understood. And yeah, back then not many Japanese folks were chatting away in English, so it's all charades and pointing. The tip about plastic food is spot on. Those restaurant window displays were amazing, looked good enough to eat, even if they were dust collectors. Finally, getting about in Tokyo. Of course, the bullet train gets a mention. They were always talked about as super fast, weren't they? But for Tokyo itself, it's all about the subway. They reckon walking is a no-go, and cycle arcade machines are pointless. There's even a picture of someone on one of those arcade machines, bless them. It warns about crowded trains, and the useful subway tips are quite practical, like station names mostly in English except for yours naturally. And the fare tip about underbuying a ticket and topping it up later sounds a bit fiddly, but ingenious as they say, must have worked. This page right then, it's all about surviving a Japanese game show, Nintendo Space World 97 to be precise. Looks like the lads at N64 Magazine are giving us the lowdown for anyone lucky enough to be heading out there. Viewer. First up, food. Apparently the restaurants are all about the plastic food displays, which is fair enough, stops any confusion if your Japanese is rubbish. And good news, they reckon the beer is top notch, so that's a bonus. There's even a little phrasebook to help you order, just in case. Jate, Japanese, yeah. Next, getting into the show itself. Sounds like queuing is a bit of a free-for-all, a bit like the Boxing Day sales at Curry's. But in Japan, pre-registering tickets is the way to go apparently, and if you try to push in, expect some serious tutting. They're also telling you to wear your press armband unless you're trying to be sneaky with your camera, which, knowing us Brits, someone definitely was. Ruthless. Show etiquette is next. They're saying Japanese game shows are well organized. Unlike the chaotic messes we're used to back home. Queuing is king, apparently, and they've got these game helpers, often young ladies dressed up, to show you the ropes. And get this, you've got to be enthusiastic about the games, no walking off in a huff if you don't like something. Imagine telling a Japanese games company their game is a steaming great dumper. Wouldn't go down well, I reckon. There are a few pictures scattered about. One of a woman dressed in camo gear, demoing a game called Wild Choppers. Sounds about right for the time. Another shot of some geezer looking at a pocket camera, and then some blurry arcade screens in the background, probably showing off the latest and greatest from Nintendo. There's a funny little caption about insert your own gag here, next to the Wild Choppers girl. Very magazine humor that. And to finish off, another box of useful phrases, including one about being a British rock star who knows shampoo personally. Cheeky lads, these N64 Magazine lot. All in all, a handy page if you were off to Space World, giving you a bit of a heads up on what to expect, Japanese style. This page depicts a feature from an old N64 magazine, likely around January 98, given the Space World 97 feet reference. Section 8, Getting the Interview, talks about the challenges for Western journalists interviewing Japanese developers. Apparently, open criticism isn't the done thing over there. The magazine offers some tips for interviews, suggesting interpreters, and positive questioning. There's a slightly sarcastic suggestion to end interviews abruptly, which seems a bit much. Section 9 is a visit to Akihabara, recommending a trip to Tokyo's electronic town for games and gadgets, suggesting things are cheaper there. There's a picture of a Pikachu, and a purple Game Boy Pocket showing Pocket Monsters, which was all the rage at the time. They mention mobile phones too. Remember how tiny they were back then? Smaller than toothpaste, apparently. Section 10, Coming Home, deals with the return journey to the UK. It suggests starting your report on the plane and enjoying the in-flight entertainment. It mentions trying to avoid customs duty on new stereos, good luck with that, and finishes with a classic British grumble about airport burgers and train delays. Happy days, maybe. This page from N64 Magazine, eh? Right then, it's all about becoming a Diddy Kong master. Looking back, Diddy Kong Racing was a bit of a big deal back in '98, wasn't it? Trying to rival Mario Kart 64, I suppose. This article is giving you the lowdown on how to get good at it. It's split into sections for kart, plane and hovercraft, covering cornering techniques for each. For the kart, they're talking about brake turning and shoulder brake turning, basically using the brakes or shoulder buttons to drift round corners. For the plane, it's dip cornering and shoulder brake cornering, which sounds pretty similar to the kart stuff, just in the air. And then for the hovercraft, it's bounce cornering, which they admit is a bit hit and miss. Apparently, it involves sharp turns on the analog stick and tapping the shoulder button. Doesn't sound that reliable, to be honest. Hit and miss, they say themselves. There's a bit about roll and loop too for the plane. Double tapping the shoulder button for rolls or loops, depending on the analog stick. They even mention the N64 magazine haven't found much use for loops. Sarcastic bunch, weren't they? Typical N64 mag. War rolls. It's all about mastering those vehicles and getting through the game, battling Whizpig and all that. Good times. Good times. James Ashton wrote this piece, it seems. Remember him? Seems like a lifetime ago now. This page from N64 Magazine, bless it, is giving us the lowdown on important Diddy Kong techniques for Diddy Kong Racing. Right then, let's see what nuggets of wisdom they're offering. First up, it's bananas. Apparently the more bananas you collect, the faster you go. Who knew, eh? Well, we probably did, but it's good of them to point it out. They're saying it's vital in adventure mode to keep up with the leaders and essential for time trials. Fair enough, bananas are key, got it. Worry. Next, coin challenges. These happen after you've beaten a world boss, and the idea is to grab 8 silver coins to finish first. They reckon practicing is a good idea to learn where they all are. Solid advice, I suppose. They suggest grabbing as many coins as possible by the end of lap 2. Also, if you fall behind, it's apparently a nightmare to catch up. And apparently, you need a banana strategy for coin races too. Blimey, it's all strategy this game, isn't it? Windmill Plains, Greenwood Village and later Spaceport Alpha are apparently coin challenge tracks, so watch out for those. Then we've got zippers. These are the red and yellow chevrons on the tracks, giving you a speed boost. Purple zips are low power if you just accelerate normally, while green zips are higher power but can be cut short if you keep the accelerator on. For maximum boost, they say turn the accelerator off until you see the colored smoke behind you. Tricky stuff, but worth knowing to get the edge, I suppose. Speed starts is next. Normal speed start is just hitting accelerate before go, which is standard. But super speed start is the proper trick, timing your accelerator press just before go for a proper blue flame boost. Essential for time trials, they say. Well, yeah, every little helps in time trials, doesn't it? Duka. Duk. Finally, Taj challenges. This mysterious Taj fella has challenges for each vehicle, earning you golden balloons. It's just racing around Adventure Island following Nintendo N flags. Sounds simple enough, though apparently, skipping 2 flags will disqualify you. Right you are, Taj, no cutting corners then, tower-ups. And lastly, power-ups. They're not massively impressed with the power-ups generally, apart from homing missiles maybe. Speed boosts, missiles and magnets are apparently the ones to go for. Oil slicks are apparently only useful for messing up zippers. Right then, power-ups are a bit rubbish, got it, Cammy. So, all in all, some handy tips for Diddy Kong Racing, just when we needed them. Good to know about the zipper tricks and super speed starts, might give you a bit of an edge down the pub in multiplayer. Though, everyone will be doing it now, won't they? Cheers, N64 Magazine. This page is a how-to guide for Diddy Kong Racing, proper classic N64 game that was. It's all about collecting 39 gold balloons. Seems like back then in '98, this was the key to unlocking stuff in Adventure Island, like getting Wizpig to open up a giant stone thingy, and then you could fly inside. Apparently, if you beat Wizpig after this, you get the game's end sequence, and some cheat codes. Pretty standard stuff for the time, cheat codes were always fun. Misa. The page is split into 2 objectives. Objective 1 is about collecting balloons in Adventure Island and gives tips for using the plane, which was a decent vehicle, to grab 4 specific balloons. One's at the Dino Domain entrance, another between waterfalls, one in the snowy bit, and the last one out to sea near Sherbet Island. They are keeping it simple for us, bless them. Say. Objective 2 is about beating Dino Domain. It mentions collecting Adventure World balloons unlocks Dino World without another race world. Which sounds a bit convoluted, to be honest, typical N64 era logic. It's suggesting you don't lift off the accelerator when you use speed-ups against the boss. Helpful advice, I suppose. After beating the boss, exiting Dino World and taking Taj's first challenge, a simple race around the island, gets you a gold balloon. Then there are coin challenges in Fossil Canyon and Hot Top Mountain. Apparently these are fairly simple, except for finding all the coins in Fossil Canyon, specifically the 8th one, which is sneakily hidden at the start. Finally, after beating the boss a second time, and doing Taj's second challenge, the hovercraft one, you should have 14 balloons. Blimey, that's a lot of faffing about for 14 balloons. There's a targets box that breaks down where you get balloons from. 39 is the overall target. 16 for winning races, 16 for coin challenges, 4 loose in Adventure Island, and 3 from Taj challenges. Makes it sound like a proper collectathon. I remember Diddy Kong Racing being pretty good fun back in the day, though maybe a bit too kiddie for some. Still, balloons, eh? Those were the days. This page is from an old N64 magazine. Looks like one of those how-to guides. This one's for becoming a Diddy Kong Racing master. It's taking us through objectives, numbered 3 through 6. Objective 3 is all about beat Snowflake Mountain. Right then, Snowflake Mountain, that's a plane level. 1, remember. The guide says to fly over the ledge and go straight through the big door. Sounds simple enough, but they say it's the hardest race to win on Snowflake Mountain. Charming! Apparently you need to take the right branch first and grab all the bananas. They also mention the Walrus boss being the easiest, and that Everfrost Peak and Snowball Valley coin challenges are tough. If you've beaten the boss twice, you're told to exit and take Taj's final challenge. It says you should have 23 balloons by then. Balloons, right, that's how you progressed in that game, wasn't it? Objective 4 moves on to beat Sherbet Island. Sherbet Island, hovercraft time. The entrance is apparently via the door, on the small island near the lighthouse. They say these hovercraft courses are easy, if you follow their tips. Use the whale to shortcut over the pirate ship, classic. And they mention collecting silver coins, one over the hatchway on the pirate ship and another on the final bend. Beating the octopus is tricky apparently, and you need to get a maximum power star and maybe fire missiles. Sounds like the usual chaos of Diddy Kong Racing. Objective 5 is beat Dragon Forest. Dragon Forest, land of the Wizpig boss battles if I recall. Entrance is behind the left-hand waterfall, to the left of the stone Wizpig in Adventure Island. Right, Adventure Island was the main hub area. They reckon winning the 4 races to get to the dragon boss shouldn't be too hard. Practicing on Greenwood Village and Windmill Plains is key they reckon for the coin challenges. Windmill Plains coin challenge, blimey, that was a pain. They suggest using speed-ups in the 3 clearings to get ahead, and to never let anyone else get in the lead on windmill planes. Good banana placing is essential apparently, and in Greenwood Village there's a coin hidden to the left after the second tunnel. Finally, for the dragon boss, fly low and use speed-ups in the clearings. By the end of Dragon Forest you should have 39 balloons. We're balloon experts by now clearly. Chuadu. Objective 6, and we're on to beat Wizpig. Big bad Wizpig himself. Entrance is through the large Wizpig mouth in the center of Adventure Island. To win against Wizpig, you need to memorize the zipper locations and hit every single one in succession. They suggest trying for a green zip from each zipper to make it last longer, and near the end, using the accelerator to shorten zips. Sounds intense. Looking at the screenshots, yeah, that's definitely Diddy Kong Racing. Brings back memories of playing that with mates after school. Good times. This page is giving some solid tips for anyone still wanting to conquer Wizpig. Simple layouts, straight to the point, just how you wanted it back then. This page details how to unlock the space levels in Diddy Kong Racing, which was all the rage back then, wasn't it? It's from N64 Magazine, must be early '98 judging by the style, so it's called How to Get to Space, and it's all about finishing off Wizpig after you think you've already beaten him. Apparently the end sequence the first time around wasn't the end, who knew? Space is a bit of a trek, they say, even for a chimp in a cart. Objective 1 is about winning trophy challenges. They're like Grand Prix races across the 4 tracks in each world. You get points for your position, and whoever has the most points at the end wins. You enter these races via the trophy cases in each world's lobby. They even give tips for each trophy race. Dino Domain's tricky one is Hot Top Mountain. Snowflake Mountain needs a good start and banana collecting on Everfrost Peak. Sherbet Island's hovercraft races shouldn't be too bad, and Dragon Forest's Dragon Forest race sounds straightforward enough after you've mastered windmill planes and Greenwood Village. Then there's Objective 2, which is about getting to space properly. You can fly there after winning all 4 trophies and going to the beach, but to really beat Wizpig, you need the TT amulet. This is in 4 bits, earned by winning the battle games in each world. To do those battle games, you need to find 4 battle keys hidden in the world's tracks. Cheeky that, isn't it? They show you where 2 of them are. One is the Dino Domain battle key on Ancient Lake, on a ramp at the start, and the Sherbet Island battle key is in an alcove at sea, on the pillars by Crescent Island start. So, looks like you have to go key hunting before you can even get to the battle games. Warrington Nook. And there's a picture of that goofy Wizpig fella looking rather pleased with himself. Probably because he's making us jump through all these hoops to get to space. Still, Diddy Kong Racing was a good laugh at the time. Proper karting fun on the N64, wasn't it? Needed to get your money's worth somehow, I suppose, with all these hidden bits and bobs. This page from the N64 Magazine, must be from around January '98 going by the little date at the bottom, is all about becoming a Diddy Kong Racing master. It's got a how-to vibe, walking you through getting further in the game. Right at the top, it talks about the battle keys. Seems like you need these to unlock battle arenas, and they're showing the keys you've collected with these little key symbols. Looks like you need 4 in total, 1 for each world. Objective 3 is all about beating DKR's 4 battle games, which are supposed to be the single biggest disappointments of DKR according to them. Bit harsh maybe, but they reckon you should beat them first go. They're showing the Icicle Pyramid battle, which is a Mario Kart style battle, and the Dark Water Beach battle. The Icicle Pyramid one you get homing missiles from red balloons, and Dark Water Beach is similar, but all on water. There's also a banana collecting game in Smoky Castle, where you have to get 10 bananas into your chest to win. Then they go into detail about getting specific keys, like the Snowflake Mountain battle key. Apparently on Walrus Cove, in a cul-de-sac left of the start line you can grab that one. And for the Dragon Forest battle key, it's above the Castle Gatehouse in Boulder Canyon, where you ring a bell by jumping to raise a drawbridge to get the key. Fair enough, sounds like typical collectathon stuff. Warrington no. Finally, Objective 4 is Fly to Space. Seems to unlock this you need all gold trophies and the TT amulet and then head to the beach on Adventure Island. Blimey, all that for space travel in Diddy Kong Racing, who knew? They show Taj the genie elephant there, looking a bit smug. Yeah, good luck with all that then if you're still stuck in Diddy Kong Racing in Yan '98. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 11, takes us back to the heady days of Diddy Kong Racing on the N64. It's all about getting the most out of the game, which, let's be honest, we probably spent hours trying to do anyway. First up, it's giving us the lowdown on finishing the space world properly, under the heading Objective 1, the space world. Apparently, there's no boss to worry about in this world, which is a bit of a relief after some of the others. The advice focuses on the coin challenges, saying you need to do them in order, because of balloon restrictions, whatever they were on about. There's a tip about a shortcut in Space Dust Alley, which they reckon is easier. Good to know. And some serious advice about Space Station Alpha being a nightmare and needing shields. Bit dramatic, but yeah, it could be a bit tricky. Bananas are key, as always with rare games, and apparently you need to keep accelerating on the zipper in Space City, or you'll fall off. Sounds like standard stuff for a racing game really, but helpful for younger players maybe. Apparently if you nail all 4 silver coin challenges in Space World you can take on Wizpig for the final showdown. Big deal, as if we hadn't figured that out already. Chi. Then, it moves on to something a bit more interesting. Secret characters. This was always the exciting bit, wasn't it? Apparently, there are 2 secret characters in Diddy Kong Racing. This bit focuses on Drumstick the turkey. Great name, they sarcastically say, Drumstick. Anyway, to get him, you need to go to Adventure Island and drive over a frog near a pond. Bit random, but that's rare for you. They reckon when you run over the frog with a crest, Drumstick will appear in a flash of fairy tale magic. Right then. They do admit Drumstick isn't that great, being a fat old bird and problems with corners, and maybe not worth the effort. Cheers for the tip then. There are screenshots showing the Space Dust Alley track, and one of Drumstick being unlocked with sparkles, and the player select screen, showing off all the usual races and the question mark for the unlockable characters. Good memories of figuring all this stuff out, wasn't it, before the internet told you everything. This page from the magazine is all about Diddy Kong Racing on the N64, good game that was. It's giving tips on how to beat Wizpig in the final race, which was a right pain if you weren't careful. They're saying to use red balloons to slow him down, especially in the tunnel section, where speed-ups are useless. Makes sense, I suppose. Those tunnels were a bit tight, weren't they? And to grab the shield balloon just before Wizpig's throne room, to avoid getting shot down. Then they mention using the speed-up after the throne room to get ahead in the last lap. Classic move, Jessine. There's also a bit about unlocking TT, that clock character. Apparently you have to beat the time trial ghosts on every single track to get him. Sounds like a proper challenge, doesn't it? They say TT is the fastest character, which is probably why you'd bother, if you were really into shaving off seconds. The reviewer, ZY or Zai as they pronounce it, reckons TT is faster than anyone else, but his handling isn't as good as Diddy or Tip-Top. Says he's still easy enough to use, and perfect for Adventure 2 mode. He's even bragging about a time of 53 seconds something on Ancient Lake. Show off. But yeah, once you've got TT, apparently there's no real reason to use anyone else. Guess they really rate him then. Good luck to anyone trying to unlock him, sounds like a proper time sink. This page from N64 Magazine, right, takes us back to Mischief Makers on the N64. Remember that one? It was a bit of a strange platformer from Enix, who were usually known for their RPGs. This article, by a chap called Jess Bickham, is all about how to get through the tricky bits. They're not kidding when they say it's not a walk in the park. Apparently there's over 50 levels, and they're calling them schizophrenically diverse, which sounds about right for that game. It was certainly bonkers, wasn't it? They're promising a hassle-free guide to the inscrutably hard bits. Optimistic, aren't they? The picture on the side is a right old mashup of characters from the game, all looking a bit chaotic, which sums up the game quite well really. Down at the bottom you can see Marina, the main character, and some little dog thing. Controls sorted? Split-second timing ready? Yeah right, if only it was that easy back then. Still, good to see they were trying to help us out with this one. Some of those levels were proper head-scratchers. This page shows a how-to guide for Mischief Makers on the N64 from N64 Magazine. Blimey, Mischief Makers, now that's a blast from the past. It was a bit of a quirky platformer, wasn't it? This page is giving tips for getting through some of the levels. World 1 seems to be Planet Clancer, and level 1.5 is called 3 Clancer Kids, where you're apparently grabbing kids. Sounds a bit dodgy now, doesn't it? Then there's Worming Up, level 1.7, which is about dealing with a giant monster worm, typical platformer stuff. Moving on to World 2, which is Maijin's Shrine, they've got level 2.8 Freefall, telling you to fall down and grab gems, and something about warp gates and spike balls. Sounds like a right old mess. Level 2.10 is Seasick Climb, which is in a swaying tower. They say to jump with the yawing motion, makes you feel queasy just reading it. And finally, level 2.11 Megan Brawl, where you're fighting Megan Jr., some huge boxing dragon. You have to catch his fists and chuck them back at him apparently. Sounds properly bonkers. There's a bit here called Flexi Fingers about how complex the N64 controller is for this game. All those buttons. They reckon it's mind-boggling but flexible. And if you don't know what you're doing, you're sunk. A bit dramatic, but yeah, the N64 controller was a bit of a beast at first. Warrington, and they've got little captions under the screenshots. Some of them are a bit cheeky, like one saying, "You wouldn't find this kind of thing in Bath," under a picture of some weird game thing, and another one saying, "Yes, you really should clean under your fingernails," with "Sorry mum" underneath. Haha, classic. It's got that whole N64 Magazine tone, a bit sarcastic but still enthusiastic about the games, good times. This page from the magazine, alright, let's have a look. It's a how-to section, seems to be about getting through some tricky bits in games. The top half is all about Mount Snow levels, looks like for mischief makers. Snowstorm Maze and Cerberus Alpha. Those level names ring a bell. Snowstorm Maze involves parking tricycles and using bombs. Sounds like a bit of a puzzle. Cerberus Alpha is a boss fight. Seems you're riding a kitten of all things against this vengeful Luna. You have to throw his missiles back at him and then chuck him about. Typical boss battle stuff, really. Down below it moves on to Asta's Lair. More mischief makers. Asta's Maze is a puzzle maze with coloured gates you have to go through in the right order. N64 order in which to takim cheeky. Then there's Ghost Catcher. Sounds like a ghost collecting level. You've got a pot to suck up ghosts. Some are hidden behind statues. Classic. Finally at the bottom, Sasquatch Beta. Another boss from mischief makers. This time it's an ape-like thing called Taras in a tank. You have to throw rocks back at him and then tip him over. Bit of wrestling with a robot ape it seems. There's a little story glory bit at the top left, talking about the humour in mischief makers, Professor Theo getting kidnapped, Marina answering prank calls. It's got that slightly knowing postmodern vibe they mentioned. Games were getting a bit clever then, weren't they? And a quote at the bottom of the Asta's Lair section. Ha! I stand atop my robot and laugh at you. Okay, yeah, that's the sort of thing. And a little comment about Cerberus Alpha being like Battle of the Planets and Transformers. Bit of a reach maybe, but I see what they mean. Overall, it's a guide to some of the trickier puzzles and boss fights in mischief makers. Seems like they thought it was a bit of a laugh, all quite quirky and Japanese. I remember mischief makers being a bit different. Shaking things about, grabbing stuff, a proper oddity on the N64. Not your typical Mario or Zelda, was it? This page is definitely focusing on the puzzle solving and boss battling side of things. Right, I think that about covers it, focusing on the key points without getting bogged down in all the level details. This page showcases the Imperial Headquarters section of a guide for mischief makers on the N64. Right then, seems like they are getting to the endgame of this shake action platformer. Gaga gaga. There are walkthroughs for a few levels here, starting with Trapped, which is a puzzle level involving pulling balls and using stars to get through. Sounds a bit fiddly. Then it moves on to Phoenix Gamma, a boss fight against Mirko who is on some kind of bird mech. You have to grab his lance and shield, then his head, and chuck missiles back at him. Sounds like your usual boss pattern learning. Next up is Inner Struggle, where you are fighting Leo's evil twin, disguised as a monolith. That's a bit bonkers, isn't it? Apparently you have to grab bad words and throw them at the monolith. Right you are. Finally there's Final Battle, against a massive fighting machine made of Mirko, Taras and Luna. You have to grab its feet and throw them about, whilst avoiding lasers. Sounds like a right old rumble. There's a bit in a box called Roll Goal, about Marina, the main character, being female, which they seem quite pleased about, saying she's not some pneumatic male fantasy, because she's a robot, naturally. Bit of a backhanded compliment if you ask me, but alright. Alright. Then there's a Buy This Game section. They're giving it a bit of praise, calling it a gloriously refreshing cocktail of irreverent humour, and comparing it to Star Fox 64, or Lilac Wars as we know it here, in terms of scale. Blimey, that's high praise indeed for what looked like a slightly odd 2D platformer. They reckon it was a bit overlooked because it's Japanese and didn't get much advertising. Typical, eh? Lastly, there's a little bit at the end hinting about secrets and yellow gems you need to find to see the real ending, saying you need to explore everywhere and not get hit at all on boss levels. Practice makes perfect, they say. Cheeky blighters. Good luck indeed if you're trying to do that. Cuckoo. All in all, looks like the guide is covering the final stretch of mischief makers, and they seem to be quietly impressed with it. Might be worth another look, perhaps. This page is from a N64 Magazine, and it's got a bit of a mixed bag really. At the top there's a shout out for folks to write game guides. Help wanted, it says. Sounds like they were after some proper experts, and promised excellent rewards. Makes you wonder what those were. Probably a free game or something. Then the main chunk of the page is all about how to beat everyone at two-player Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey. Wayne Gretzky's. That was a decent hockey game back in the day on the N64, not quite Blades of Steel on the NES, but still, good fun for a laugh with your mates. This article is by a reader called Benjamin Coffer, giving us his guide. Apparently N64 Magazine had reviewed it way back in issue 6, so this is a bit of a retro look at it. The article talks about settings, recommending things like difficult / versus easy for difficulty, bit cheeky, suggesting you mess with your mate by switching the difficulty just as you start. They suggest arcade game type, regulation rink size, and playing for 130 periods. They even mention puck streak should be on, unless your opponent wears bifocals. There's a bit about cheating too, suggesting you send your opponent off to make coffee while you quickly put in the super team's cheat by holding L and pressing C buttons in a specific sequence. Cheeky, but we've all been there, haven't we? Bull. There are a couple of screenshots from the game showing the options menu and a pause screen. It mentions putting the controller in the third port for some reason, and picking Z Williams from the super team, ready to face off. Sounds like good solid advice for anyone wanting to properly trounce their mates at Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey. Good times. This page from N64 Magazine, likely from around January 98, is giving us the lowdown on how to properly thrash your mates at Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey 98 on the N64. It's a how-to Woito. Beat everyone at 2-player Wayne Gretzky guide, which is pretty cheeky. Woito. The first bit is all about winning the face-off. Apparently most people just let the computer handle it. But this guide suggests mashing the B button as the ref drops the puck. If you win the puck, the advice is to bomb it down the side, and then cut in for a goal, holding down A and B as you approach the net. Sneaky. Then there's a section on losing the face-off, which is bound to happen. The tip here is to absolutely clatter the player who's got the puck with left C, and while they're getting up you can just skate past and score. Bit unsporting, but hey, all's fair in love and hockey, right? Apparently shooting hard enough sends the net and goalie flying, which sounds rather amusing. The attacking section breaks down into build-up and on the break. Build-up basically says attacking can be done in two ways, either build-up or on the break, profound stuff, and suggests there are limited options in build-up play. The advice is to either repeatedly hit B then A, circle around and pass, or just punch everyone to the floor and let your CPU teammate skate through. Charming. On the break is apparently a more common way to score. The guide recommends not using turbo when you're breaking as it makes it harder to cut in. Instead, skate down the wing without turbo and then you can either cut across and bury the puck near or far post, or set up a one-timer for a teammate. It mentions scoring in Wayne Gretzky is all about changing the angle for the goalie, which makes sense. Another tip for a breakaway is to just run straight at the goalie and slip it in at the last moment, but apparently that takes practice. Cheeky little go, and a directional button prompt at the end, typical magazine page flair. Overall, it's your classic N64 game tips page, trying to give you the edge over your mates in a bit of digital ice hockey. Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey 98 was a pretty decent arcade-style hockey game back then, not exactly super realistic but good for a laugh with your mates. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 11 it must be, dives into the world of Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey. Remember that one? It's all about improving your game, specifically the defense and attack. Under defense they're talking about cooperation, basically saying the CPU control players aren't the sharpest skates on the ice. No surprises there, eh? They wander about aimlessly like lost sheep, and you end up doing all the work, circling around like a loon trying to get the puck. The solution, apparently, is switching players to give the CPU a nudge in the right direction, a bit of encouragement. Then there's tackles. Simple advice, really. Use left C to tackle. They make a point that in one-player games, CPU attacks always seem to involve a one-timer, which they helpfully explain is a pass and first-time shot, and advise you to get rid of anyone looking to receive a pass. Sensible stuff. There's a screenshot showing a bit of ice hockey action, with the score Williams 1, and what looks like Anaheim or Calgary 2. Classic N64 graphics, blocky but charming in their own way. Warrington. Then, flipping down we're onto attacking continued. First up is Wonetwas. They reckon this is good when you've got a 2-on-1 situation. Apparently, your CPU teammate might be a bit daft and send the puck deep into your own half. Typical AI, eh? They mention developments such as the 123 or 121 timer, which sounds a bit fancy for Gretzky's but alright. Another screenshot here, this time it's the second period, showing a player near the goal. Looks like a bit of a scramble. Carré. Finally, one-timers get their own section. They say it's a great way to score if you get the angle right. It's described as a pass across the wing for a quick shot. They then get a bit sarcastic, asking, what does Mr. Gretzky think he plays? Football? Bit harsh maybe. But they do concede that looking up for passes will help you take out defenders. There's a replay screenshot here, third period, score 10-10 stuff. Shows a player taking a shot, classic hockey pose. Cheer! Overall, pretty standard tips for Wayne Gretzky's. Nothing revolutionary, but back then in '98, it was probably helpful for getting the hang of it. Good old N64 Mag, always had your back for gaming know-how. This page shows two separate articles about a hockey game, looks like Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey. Go going by the name check in the CPU control section. The fighting article talks about how easy it is to get into fights by bashing the left C button, apparently enough to cause tendinitis. Ouch. It mentions when your anger meter is full, you can get into fights by fouling your own team for a bit of a breather in the game. Cheeky. Apparently when a fight breaks out you gotta hammer up and be like mad. The reviewer, Ed, mentions using a SharkPad Pro controller with autofire for an unfair advantage, showing his competitive spirit, and maybe bending the rules a bit. The CPU control article is about playing man versus man in Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey. It suggests that winning without some CPU assistance is tough. Apparently, the CPU in attack mode isn't that helpful, but in defense it does nothing at all. The control system is compared to NBA Jam on the PlayStation, where you can tell the CPU what to do, and in this game, if you press pass when the CPU has the puck, it's like calling for it to score. A bit of a weird system, it sounds like. Thanger. Over on the right side of the page is a big advert for Games Master Magazine, January 1998 issue, boasting a 1998 mega preview special. They're getting us all hyped for the next 12 months being amazing for the N64, mentioning some absolute crackers like The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, Yoshi's Story, Super Mario 64 2, which we now know as Super Mario 64 sequel never happened. Maybe they meant Super Mario 64 and Mario 64 2 as separate games, huh? And the N64 DD. They reckon it's the most exciting time for the N64 ever, and to not miss their pull-out guide to the biggest games of 1998. Below that are some game characters featured. I can see characters from Resident Evil 2 like Claire and Leon, Banjo-Kazooie, and Yoshi, all the big hitters for the N64 back then. It's trying to grab your attention from all discerning news agents now, so it's a proper old-school magazine advert. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 11 it looks like, is from the Tips Extra section, right at the back of the mag, where you'd flick to for some cheeky cheats and hints. First up, it's got Extreme G, which was a futuristic racer, proper fast and pretty decent at the time. It lists a few cheats like entering names as cheat codes. Roller makes you a rock, apparently. Fisheye gives you a goldfish bowl view and super fast racing. Banana is for constant power slides and ugly mode for rougher graphics. Bit of a weird one, that last one. Who wants worse graphics? Then there's anti-grav, to race on the ceiling, which sounds kinda cool. And if you complete the first setting on Extreme, a new bike called Roach is available, and beat the last setting on Extreme and you get extra levels. Typical cheat stuff really. If you can't be bothered with all that, it gives you a password 51GG 95 inches to unlock all tracks and the Roach bike. Handy for lazy gamers, eh? Then, underneath that, it moves on to GoldenEye 007, surprise surprise. It talks about precision in the game, saying blasting away will get you killed quick. It's all about being clinical, aiming for the torso and head, and limb shots might not be as effective. It mentions not to forget the duck and lean moves, and using cover. Solid advice for GoldenEye really. Running and gunning wasn't always the best tactic, unless you were on paintball mode with mates. It also mentions not having to shoot everyone. Stealth is good. Yeah, telling us how to play GoldenEye like we didn't know after months of playing it non-stop. Resura. There's a section on control roll for GoldenEye 2, saying you need to be comfy with the controls, which is fair enough. It shows two control styles, 1.1 Honey and 1.2 Solitaire. Honey is described as movement with the analog stick, and direction with the C buttons, the default setup, and probably the most intuitive and best to use. Solitaire is described as movement with C buttons and direction with the analog stick, saying it's like Turok controls for those dino-bashing fans. Each control style has a little pic of the N64 controller layout, with labels for AIM, look, move, action, weapon, fire and pause. Bit basic really. Most of us had already picked our favorite control scheme by this point. Probably Honey as it says. So yeah, standard tips page really for Extreme G and GoldenEye. Nothing groundbreaking, but probably useful for some younger players or those who hadn't quite got the hang of it yet. Good times. This page from N64 Magazine, back from January 1998 it would be, features a section called Reader's Top 10 Tips. It's all about us lot sending in our best game tips and cheats for the N64. Seems like everyone was hooked on GoldenEye 007 back then, as there are 3 tips just for that. First GoldenEye tip is about level 17 caverns. Apparently shooting crates gives you ammo, but if you shoot the one on the right in the main console room near the guard, it does a whole chain reaction thing, releasing smaller boxes and then computer screens. And if you destroy those you get 2 AR-33 assault rifles, which the reader reckons are top-notch guns in the game. Sounds like a bit of a faff for some ammo if you ask me, but each to their own. Next up is Mario Kart 64, with a tip for Koopa Troopa Beach to get a fast lap time of around 10 seconds. Sounds like you need to be a bit of a pro, going forward on Koopa Troopa Beach, turning around, going up a cliff, doing speed boosts and jumps to get over the rock. Sounds complicated, but this Richard Turner from Portsmouth reckons with practice you'll nail it on every lap. Good luck with that then. The third GoldenEye tip is for the second bunker level on secret or zero agent mode. If you hide in the cells, the guards chasing you can't shoot through the bars, but they'll try to open the door, and you can just keep it closed and keep doing this until all the guards are dead. Makes the level easier apparently. Bit cheeky that, like cheesing the level really. Then there's a Lilac Wars tip. Finish Katina so Bill will help you, then select change path to Sector X, take the warp to Sector Z, and if your wingmen are still alive, Falco will ask you to blast the gates. Slippy and Peppy will also help, and apparently Bill will too, even though you've changed paths. Sounds a bit convoluted, but alright. Another GoldenEye one, this time for level 14, the train. Apparently you can find a messy but effective RCP-90 machine gun in one of the last 2 boxes of the first train unit, but only on agent mode. On secret agent you'll find a Dostovoy instead. Bit picky about your difficulty level to get the best gun then. Sure. 6th tip is another Lilac Wars one suggesting you make formation with Peppy, Falco and Slippy. No details why, just do it apparently. Bikiga. Bikiga. Tip number 7 is for Top Gear Rally. After completing each season in Championship, you get extra cars like the Milk Float, Helmet Car, Beach Ball, Cube Car, and finally, Mirror Car if you press bottom C to get to the finish. The hidden ski jump mine track is unlocked by coming first on each track in the final season of both normal and mirror championships. Only available in arcade and time trial apparently. Crikey, sounds like a lot of effort for a virtual milk float. Pia. Blastcore gets a mention for an easier way of making life simpler on Diamond Sands. By rather than sliding through the sheds, you can use the railway tracks to give you a downwards push on them. A similar effect it is then. Pilotwings 64 is next, suggesting if you use the cheat from issue 7 where you clip the ground to gain speed, and then dive to lose altitude, your speed will increase even more. Using Goose, one reader says they managed 401 km per hour, but lost control of being able to move up or down above 390 km per hour. Sounds a bit risky but fast. Finally for tip number 10, Blastcore again. Stomp J-Bomb onto a TNT crate. It shoots out and doesn't stop for ages. Great fun, according to Keith, from County Durham. Simple pleasures, eh? At the bottom there's a form to send in your own tips. For game name, what you found, name, address and postcode. You could send it to Tips Extra, N64 Magazine in Bath, or send a photocopy if you didn't want to cut up your magazine. They even mention you get a shiny N64 pin badge, and something a little bit special for the coveted number 1 slot. Good times, trying to get your tip in the mag and get your name printed. This page is from an old issue of N64 Magazine, issue 11, dated January 1998. It's got a section called Tips Extra, and it's all about the Nintendo hotline, and some GoldenEye 007 tips, typical stuff back then, when the internet wasn't quite what it is now for game help. There's a bit at the start talking about how popular the N64 is, so popular in fact that they've started an automated phone hotline, costing 50 pence a minute. Cheeky! They list games covered by this hotline: GoldenEye, Mario 64, Shadows of the Empire, Lilac Wars and Diddy Kong Racing, all the big hitters at the time really. They're trying to reassure readers that the regular hotline is still there too, just to help with the queues I suppose. There's a phone number there, 08916 69945, probably doesn't work anymore does it? Then it dives into GoldenEye 007 questions. Seems like everyone was stuck on this game back then, and rightly so, it was brilliant. There are questions about getting past gate on the first level, powering down the communications dish on Mission 2 Part 1, where to put the covert modem on the dam level, opening security doors on the facility, finding the satellite and getting the telemetry data on the silo level, where to meet Yanis in Statue Park, and why Natalia keeps getting killed in Statue Park 2. The answers are pretty straightforward, typical tips page stuff, telling you to look for switches, use the B button, the Z trigger, place the modem behind crates, all standard game guide advice. There are a few little screenshots showing the gameplay, a truck, some snowy area, a computer screen, the satellite, and Trevelyan looking a bit smug. And of course a big picture of Bond himself looking very suave in his tux at the bottom. Pierce Brosnan era I reckon. Good times. GoldenEye was the game to have back then, wasn't it? This page shows a classic Nintendo hotline feature from an N64 magazine, back when you actually had to phone up for game tips. Imagine that. It's got that big phone number splashed across the top, for the princely sum of a premium rate call no doubt. Shotra. The page is all about getting help with your games, specifically GoldenEye 007 it seems, which back then was absolutely massive. Everyone was playing it. We've got questions from readers clearly stuck in various parts of the game. Someone's lost Natalia after rescuing her. Another can't get into the train depot. Classic GoldenEye moments of frustration. There's even a question about protecting Natalia in the control stage, which was always a pain as she wasn't the brightest AI companion, bless her. They're also asking about disabling train brakes and even how to off Trevelyan on the cradle stage, so it covers a fair bit of the game. The answers are typical hotline stuff, giving you just enough info without spoiling everything. They even have a general hints and tips box, telling you to aim for the head and use stealth. Groundbreaking advice for a first-person shooter, eh? There's a screenshot of the game too, looking very blocky, and 64-bit. How far we've come. Worry. It's a proper blast from the past. Seeing this reminds you how different gaming help was before the internet and YouTube walkthroughs. You actually had to pay to get these nuggets of wisdom. Still, good times. This page, from what looks like a gaming mag, probably around the time the N64 was king, shows the I'm the best section right at the back, no doubt, for showing off your high scores. Seems like everyone was sending in their best times for Super Mario 64 and Wave Race 64. Warrant. There's a bit called Star Performance, giving props to some lad Aaron Carroll from Yorkshire, who apparently finished all 57 platinum medals in Blast Core. Good effort, I suppose, though they're taking the mickey a bit, calling him Britain's best games player, next to his enthusiastic photo. Then there's the actual leaderboards, loads of names and times, for different bits of Super Mario 64, and Wave Race 64. For Mario there's Foot Race with Cooper the Quick and Peach Slide sections, all Pale region times, with people like Owain Brimfield, Barry Gannon and blokes from all over, like Sheffield and even Greece. Wave Race 64 has Time Trial Sunny Beach, and Stunt Mode Dolphin Park, again for Pale, and some for American and Japanese versions. You've got names like Gareth Gibson, Andrew Cole, and even someone from Norway. Good to see the international competition was fierce back then, even for Sunny Beach time trials. Looks like some lucky Steve Ridley smashed the Koopa Troopa Beach score and bagged himself a SharkPad Pro controller. Remember those? Not exactly the official Nintendo pad, but hey, free stuff is free stuff. His time was 0138 inches 31, which must have been pretty rapid for the time. Kia. Lastly, they've got a this month's score to beat for Star Fox, or Lilac Wars as it was sometimes called. They want to see who can get the most hits on Corneria, with a target of 263. Seems like they were always running these little competitions in the mags back then. Good times if you had the skills to get your name in print. This page from Club 64 looks like the letters page for N64 Magazine, harking back to January 98. Seems like they're sifting through the postbag and getting ready for the new year. Right at the top, there's the contact info for sending in your letters, back when email addresses were still a bit of a novelty for some. First letter is Sugar High, some bloke called Stuart in Manchester chuffed to bits because he won a Hot Wheels model vehicle. Merry Christmas to him indeed, hope he was excited. Then there's He Said No, a young lad moaning about not being able to have a go on GoldenEye in a shop. Those were the days, weren't they? Crowded around a demo pod in Dixon's or something, trying to get a turn. Poor kid probably just wanted a blast on the facility level. No, my ears is next. Jonathan from Bury St Edmunds is having a proper moan about the price of SCART cables and games at Toys R Us. Says he got stung on a SCART cable and found GoldenEye and Lilac Wars cheaper there, or Star Fox 64 as it was called over here. Remember those days of hunting for the best deals on carts? Proper faff. Icy Water is a funny one. Colin in Bishopton is asking about a glitch in Mario Kart 64 on Sherbet Land with the ghosts going mental after you hit the icy water. Never had that myself, sounds a bit odd. They say it might be a PAL version quirk with Luigi saying Icky is a poo, classic Nintendo weirdness. Something is about Mario Kart 64 secrets. Grant from Glasgow heard that doing 3 courses quickly unlocks something. The mag is a bit cheeky and tells him to pay attention, as they already covered it in a previous issue. Turns out, if you get certain times in time trial on Luigi Raceway, Mario Raceway and Royal Raceway, you get to race against CPU ghosts of Luigi, Mario and Princess. They even give the ghost times, about 2 minutes 10 for Luigi, 1 minute 47 for Mario, and 3 minutes 15 for Princess. Good luck beating those. Stumbled is a reader, Peter from Felbridge, pointing out some goofs in past mags, something about a Star Fox 64 preview with the wrong picture, and a FIFA 64 preview mistake. Everyone makes mistakes, I suppose. The Barnes is a quick one from someone loving Pilot Wings 64. Says he's had it since March and still can't get enough. Pilot Wings, now there's a game you could lose hours to just flying around that island and popping balloons. Proper chill out game that was. Or T-Bo. Last one is A Job Reading, from Jerry in Southampton. He's having a dig at the black text on dark blue backgrounds. saying it's hard to read and wants white text on dark backgrounds instead. Fair point actually, wasn't always the easiest to read some of these mags in bad light, was it? Ed at the mag says they do it to blend the words into the background so they don't distract from the pictures. Artistic, eh? All in all, just your typical letters page really. Readers having their say about games, glitches, prices, and the mag itself. Takes you back, doesn't it? This page depicts a letter section in N64 Magazine. Looks like issue 11, January 98, alright, so we're talking early days of the N64. There's a few sections here, let's see. Bar none. Someone's raving about Rare's contributions over Christmas, reckon they proved the N64's a beast, which it was to be fair, compared to the PlayStation and Saturn at the time. Then My Town, a Spanish fella called Pablo Gramont likes the mag, says it's the best and better than Spanish mags, cheeky. He's moaning about how hard it is to get hold of the N64 in Spain and the cost of imports, always a pain back then, wasn't it? Bray. 156 miles per hour section is about multi-racing championship, someone querying the speed, and Ed, the editor, corrects them, saying they mistakenly converted kilometers to miles per hour. Classic Ed, always a bit smug when he's right. Stomping is about their Japanese correspondent, Mr. Everingham, who apparently was a bit down in the dumps lately because of Osumo. Must have been a bit tense waiting for its release. He's fine now apparently, thank goodness. There's a Dream On section with reader ideas for games. Constructor 64DD. Someone wants a conversion of Constructor for the 64DD, the disk drive add-on. They suggest multiplayer building and knocking down buildings, which sounds alright actually, if a bit complicated for the 64DD. Predator 64 inches now, that's a blast from the past. Someone wants a Predator game, like the Arnold Schwarzenegger film, for the N64. Missions involving South American communists and drug dealers, very 80s action film vibe, haha. They suggest gameplay like GoldenEye and Turok, with Predator vision and cloaking. Olympics, 64 inches. A reader wants a Mario Olympics game, with athletic events, power-ups and everything. Bit like Sega's Athlete Kings but cuter. Not a bad shout actually, a Mario sports game was always welcome. Eh? There's a bit at the bottom called the N64 board, which is like a notice board in the office. They've pinned up fan mail and drawings. There's a mention of Mario muscles being a bit disturbing in some fan art, someone's Power Pro baseball drawings, a penguin drawing which is a festive treat, and someone called Michael Almond sent in the best Bomberman picture, purple with blue bits sounds. Interesting. They also mention liking Beavis and Butthead and thanking someone for a Christmas card. Pengri. And lastly, there's an advert at the bottom for sending in stuff to the N64 board at their address in Bath. So yeah, just your typical letters and bits and bobs page from an N64 mag back in the day. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 11, January 1998, brings back a few memories, doesn't it? Right then, let's have a look. First up, there's a section for letters. Some fella named Anon in Farnborough wants coloured rumble packs and bigger memory cards. Ed, the editor, pipes up saying Blaze do coloured memory cards, but rumble packs are all grey. Someone else is arguing about how to pronounce Ganbare from Goemon. Seems like a bit of a non-issue, but hey, letters pages were always full of that kind of thing. And then there's a Did You Know section, someone mentioning 2 trains in Mario Kart 64 Calamari Desert, which is a bit of a head-scratcher, and another about Charles Martinet being the voice of Mario and in Space Quest 6. Space Quest 6, blimey, bit of a deep cut for an N64 mag. Then we've got Invention Corner, always a laugh. Someone's come up with a steering pack, so you can turn your N64 controller into a steering wheel, which is a bit daft when you could just buy a steering wheel. They reckon it'll cost £55, no pedals though. Another bright spark has invented a 4-sided coin out of Irish coins sellotaped together, right? And then a boot pack, some kind of football boot with sensors so you can take penalties in games. Sounds a bit elaborate for a penalty kick in FIFA 98 if you ask me. And they want £20 for that. There's an article called Popped It about dodgy memory packs. This Stuart Robinson from Alfreton is having trouble with his Logic 3 and Datel memory packs losing data, but a Blaze one is working fine for him, even on import games. We had our fair share of dodgy memory cards back then, didn't we? A little filler bit called Some More with names Russell Coughlin and Glenn, and then finally an article called Tiny Clocks worrying about the Millennium Bug and the 64DD's clock in the year 2000. Someone called Seb Long from Bognor Regis is worried his Nintendo is gonna mess up when we hit the 21st century. Ed reassures him Nintendo will probably use 4-digit dates, so it should be alright. Millennium Bug, what a palaver that was. So yeah, typical letters and invention page from N64 mag really. Bit of reader interaction, daft inventions, and worrying about the future of gaming tech. Good times. This page depicts a typical magazine page from back in the day. specifically an issue of N64 Magazine. It's teasing what's coming in issue 12, with a big headline, "Going for Cold," and a chap skiing down a slope to really hammer home the winter sports theme. Apparently even back then they were worried about global warming, bless them. Weighing in, it looks like they're going to be giving Nagano Winter Olympics a good look, alongside Snowboard Kids, which was a bit quirky from Atlas, and Nintendo's own 1080 Degrees. Snowboarding can't go wrong with a bit of that. They're also mentioning Twisted Edge Snowboarding, Top Gear Rally Folk making a snowboarding game, and something called Imagineer's Snowspeeder. Sounds like they're really piling on the snow games for this issue. And the Norsa. There's also a bit about a free gift, something saucy apparently, which is always a bit of a draw, isn't it? Tool. On the right-hand side, there's an index for the current issue, number 11. Let's have a gander at what they were covering then. Looks like they were previewing Acclaim Sports Soccer, probably another average footy game for the N64, and Aerofighters Assault versus Wild Choppers dogfighting games, always a bit of alright. Banjo-Kazooie is getting a future look, which everyone was properly buzzing about back then, and Buggy Boogie preview, no idea what that is, probably forgettable. Cruisin' World preview, those arcade races were a bit of fun in their day. Warranty KR News, that's Diddy Kong Racing, which was a decent kart racer. Famista 64 review, another one I don't recall much, must have been a bit niche. F-Zero X Future. Look, now that's more like it, proper speed freaks were loving that game. Grand Prix race preview, generic racing game alert maybe? May ye? There's a How to Beat Everyone guide for Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey 90, which was probably useful if you were into your ice hockey, and how to become a Diddy Kong master, and even how to make mischief mischievously in Mischief Makers. Someone was clearly having a laugh with those titles. MK Mythologies. Sub-Zero review. That Mortal Kombat spin-off wasn't supposed to be up to much, and NHL Breakaway 98 preview, another ice hockey one. Osumo review, now that's a bit different. Sumo wrestling on the N64, who'd have thought. Powerslide preview, Reverend Limit preview, more races. San Francisco Rush review, that one was a bit mad, wasn't it? Warrington also. Spaceworld 64DD and Spaceworld Diary must be all about the 64DD add-on that hardly anyone had. Spaceworld Games of 1998 and Spaceworld Miyamoto. Nintendo were pushing that Spaceworld event hard. Dorigobu, V-Rally, 64 preview, yet another racer. WCW vs NWO review, wrestling games were all the rage. And finally, Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and 1080 Degrees Snowboarding are both getting future looks again. They must have been really hyping those up. So yeah, a pretty standard issue preview page, lots of races and winter sports games to look forward to, and a free gift to tempt you to pick up issue 12. Standard mag fare from back then, really. This page depicts an advert for F1 Pole Position 64, you know, one of those early N64 races. It's boasting about being the most authentic Formula 1 game ever. A bit of a claim there, lads, considering how blocky it looks now, but back then those graphics were alright, I suppose. They're banging on about accurate cars and famous drivers, realistic spin-outs and skid turns, all the usual racing game guff, really. Looking down the side of the page, it's the Reviews This Issue section. Looks like ZY, or ZY as they want to be called now, has been busy. San Francisco Rush, Wild Choppers, Aerofighters Assault, 64 Osumo and even Wheel of Fortune are all getting the once-over. Crikey, Wheel of Fortune on the N64? Didn't see that coming. Then there's the other great stuff section mentioning some massive Nintendo Space World 97 coverage. Remember Space World? That was a big deal back then, all the hype for the new games. And look at this list of other games being featured. Banjo-Kazooie and Zelda. Ocarina of Time, proper classics those two. 1080 Snowboarding and F-Zero X, fast-paced stuff. Pocket Monsters Stadium. Must be that Pokemon game everyone's going mad for. Super Mario RPG 2. Diddy Kong Racing Masterclass. Beating Mischief Makers. Wayne Gretzky tips and every N64 game reviewed. Blimey, they've been busy. Sounds like a packed issue, this one.